best thing to do. Yeah.
No? Hello? There we go. I am really looking forward to this session. We're going to dig into how to build financially viable models for responsible recruitment. We're going to hear directly from recruiters who are doing that, and we're going to learn their lessons. So we're going to dive straight in. If you think you have a post-lunch lull, spare a thought for our two virtual panelists for whom it is 2 in the morning. So with huge thanks and appreciation, I will introduce them in just a second. My name is Anna Pinar. I'm the Executive Director of the Responsible Labour Initiative, which is part of the wider Responsible Business Alliance. We provide practical tools for implementation of responsible recruitment, due diligence, and forced labor issues in supply chains. Part of that has been, over the past 5 years, we've implemented a program called the Responsible Recruitment Program, funded by the Walmart Foundation and partnering with the IOM, International Organization for Migration, to build the capacity of recruitment agencies coming from Indonesia into Malaysia, Nepal into Malaysia, and connected to our member supply chains. And so I am delighted to introduce our panelists here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I want to hear from each of you how you're connected and how your role and your organization is supporting responsible recruitment. I believe we have Carmel and Pranay on the line. We do. This is wonderful. Okay, Carmel, can you hear us? And we can see you. Would you like to introduce yourself and give us a sense of what your role is and how you're supporting responsible recruitment, please? Hopefully the video will start working. Could we get her voice, even if it's not video? Well, while we're working on that, let's hear from Pavel. Pavel, go ahead and introduce yourself and how you're connected to the world of responsible recruitment.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone, for having me today with you. I am Pavel Szalus from the International Organization for Migration, IOM. And IOM is an intergovernmental organization. It's the UN Migration Agency. We heard a lot today in a keynote speaker about the importance of the labor migration, how it affects the demographics, global economy, the labor market, and all the other things. We also understand this in IOM as well. That's why the labor migration is an important part of the IOM's work. And as such, we also know that fair and ethical recruitment is a critical part of the good governance of labor migration. And also it's important to fulfill the development potential of labor migration, which labor migration brings itself, because that's how we perceive also the labor migration, fair and ethical recruitment, but it's a positive thing, which we should not be scared or afraid of, and there's a huge development potential if it's done in the right way. And in IOM, we have the very comprehensive stream of work related to recruitment with the whole range of tools, solutions, partnerships, Anna mentioned just one, programs implemented globally. For us at IOM, it's obvious that labor migration is a good thing. We talked about it a couple of times today, just to reinstate it. And this is something not to be afraid of or be scared of, right? And it's happening anyways. You can just need to embrace it. We also know that well-governed labor migration and recruitment has a huge benefit potential which outweigh the challenges. At the same time at IOM, we recognize that there are challenges, right? if it's not done in the right way. We heard today the story of real migrant workers talking about the challenges and struggles they do. We do recognize those things, and we work a lot with partners around the world to overcome the challenges and take the best what the well-managed labor migration can get. And we truly believe for our daily work, we learn it and we truly believe in this, but the only way to make it work is through multi-stakeholder joint venture, which is executed through something we call it IOM, from the ground level all the way to our Director General, whole of society, whole of the government approach. And when you talk about the whole of society, whole of the government approach, we're talking about both sides of the process. The countries and communities of origin engage with the countries and communities of destination, and that's where it works, right? And I want to emphasize it because it's important. Sometimes we understand whole of society, whole of the government in the destination country. We don't care about the origin, or the vice versa. It has to be on both sides of the process. I'll stop here because I guess my 5 minutes is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. Let's see if we can get Carmel and Pranay on the line. No? Okay, not yet. Well, I'll go ahead with the questions for Pavel. So the purpose of this session is really to dig into how to make responsible recruitment an attractive business model and investment. And our learning, certainly from the RLI side through the responsible recruitment program, is that the majority of the participants have challenges in implementing a no-fees model across all of their business operations. And to really qualify as a fully no fees, in the IRIS certification, as well as most sort of certifications that are working with recruitment agencies, you have to implement that policy across all corridors for all of your customers. And if you're a recruitment agency that comes across an employer that will not bear the full cost of recruitment, that then is a challenge on you. And from our perspective as RVA, or RLI, that would be a finding on the recruitment agency as well as on the supplier, right? But you can't be a fully certified, or you can't get to the full verification stage without all of the employers that you're providing workers to bearing that cost of recruitment. And so that mixed business model that currently still exists, and Pavel also, you could maybe comment on this, is part of the key challenge of how do we actually make this financially viable? Because what we hear from recruitment agencies is this, the need to have that subsidy and work with both models, right? So we have a fee model and a no-fee model, but it really completely depends on whether or not the employer is bearing that full cost. And the recruitment agencies are often trying to sort of, the ones certainly in the IRIS program I know are working with the employer, sort of working back up the supply chain to say, look, we want you to bear this cost. And if the employer is not willing, as I said, that becomes a challenge. Carmel and Pranay, thank you so much for joining us. So glad we can see you and hear you. So Carmel, why don't we go ahead and start with your introduction. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what role you play in the world of responsible recruitment? Just give us a second because we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm the managing director at Honest Jobs. Honest Jobs is part of the Fair Employment Foundation group of entities. And our mission at FAIR is to build market-based solutions to end forced labor of migrant workers. And in 2014, we launched Fair Employment Agency, which is a revenue-generating ethical recruitment agency placing domestic workers here in Hong Kong. Since we launched, we've placed over 8,000 workers free from recruitment debt and is now one of the top recruitment agencies for Filipino workers here in Hong Kong. And then when we then launched Honest Jobs in 2020 as an early stage incubator fund to influence and grow the ethical recruitment industry. We set up originally Honest Jobs after facing regulatory challenges and initially trying to set up our own sending side employment agency in the Philippines back in 2019. From our learnings there, we realized that we needed to localize our approach instead of building fair agencies in different markets. Through Honest Jobs, we can replicate and spread our influence and model for ethical recruitment much more quickly while reducing country-specific risk. Local social entrepreneurs who share our values are also better positioned to navigate country regulations. And at Honest Jobs, not only do we provide funding, but we also leverage our on-the-ground experience and networks and provide mentorship and advisory support to early stage and established businesses with the goal of growing the responsible recruitment sector across other geographies and industries beyond domestic work. We collaborate with a wide network of actors as we set out to build an ecosystem of ethical recruiters. Since we launched, we have invested in 2 agencies thus far. Our first investment is in Pink Collar, which is Malaysia's first ethical recruitment agency. They were established in 2019, and we invested in the team in late 2020. The young team has been resilient and managed to keep their doors open through the pandemic with the borders closed and are seeing early signs of business sustainability. They were even profitable last year. And they have just upgraded their license earlier this year, which will allow them to recruit and place outside of just the domestic worker sector. Late last year, we invested in our second agency, Good Hire, out of Singapore, which is also tackling the migrant domestic worker sector. They were established in 2016 and steadily growing through 2019 until the pandemic, and we're supporting the founder in marketing and operational expansion. And today on this panel, I hope to share our perspective and market insights as an investor, as well as our on-the-ground experiences and challenges from our investees' perspective. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Carmel. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we can learn from your experience. And it really goes to Rebecca's point this morning about needing to build this new industry. And you are on the ground doing that. So we can't wait to learn from you. Pranay, go ahead and tell us about yourself and what brings you to the world of responsible recruitment.
Okay. Namaste, everybody. My name is Pranay Rai. I head the compliance team of International Manpower Recruitment. And when we are talking about international manpower recruitment, we were established in the year 2004. But during the year 2015 and 16, we came to know about what ethical recruitment was about, because we were mentored and we happened to attend a workshop conducted by Responsible Business Alliance in the year 2016. And then we tried to adopt the ethical recruitment practice. And to let you know, during the year 2016, we were among the top agencies of Nepal, where we were in terms of deployment of the workers. And then we adopted a hybrid system of hybrid model in the sense that we took up demands of both ethical and unethical. And till the year 2018 came in, we were confident enough that we could get into 100% ethical recruit. And then from 18 till date, it's been about 7 years. And I must tell you that it's been about 7 years. And given the opportunity, and if we see to the chart in terms of deployment of the workers from Nepal amongst all the agencies, we are leading the chart, which means that ethical recruitment is being accepted. And we hope to sustain ourselves. We hope to do well and be an example in the industry so that people also adopt this model of recruitment. Thank you.
That's fantastic. And congratulations, Pranay, for demonstrating that it can be done, that it's viable. And thank you for being here to be able to learn from you so that we can really share these lessons with others. So I'll jump into the first question. And Pranay, if we stay with you, could you give us an up-close sense of those challenges that you faced in terms of achieving that financial viability? Tell us a little bit more up close what that's like for you and how that has impacted your ability to responsibly recruit workers.
All right. Without a doubt, of course, ethical recruitment is more time intensive and costly. So if you look at the recruitment process, what has happened is like, I'd like to put it in 5 points. So that would be like the administrative requirements are very demanding in the sense that there's a lot of paperwork to be done and a lot time consuming, where we have to be meticulous on planning each and every recruit. And of course, in terms of sustainability, when we are talking about financial viability, yes, the service fee is very limited in the sense that we have a very small margin, and having to give up with the traditional recruitment, of course, it's sometimes it's very intensive, and yes, we are not really relying on individual brokers now. We have given up with sub-agents, which means that we got to communicate each and every candidate on our opportunities for our within our company as well.
That's great. Can I just ask a follow-up question? Did you say that you conduct due diligence in the destination country on the employers themselves?
Yes, we do conduct employer due diligence. We try and make it a point. We've got two ways of doing the employer due diligence. One is on-site visit, by having to visit the premises of the employers. And the second one is we do it on a remote level in the sense that we go to the social media pages, we surf the internet, and then we try and manage the risk.
Wow, so you do sort of an open source scan of them. That's great. That's fantastic. Carmel, same question to you on the challenges of financial viability. You've obviously seen this up close, running an organization, running a recruitment agency yourself, but then also investing in new ones. Tell us about that.
Yes, it's similar to Pranay. I mean, he's working in supply chain, and I think we're seeing similar challenges in the domestic worker sector that is in parallel. So firstly, there's definitely unfair competition in our space. There's unfair competition with the recruitment market currently that we're seeing in the 3 markets, competing with unethical agencies charging fees to domestic workers in order to cover the true costs of migrant labor recruitment. And as an ethical agency, it is hard to compete in that type of market, right? Margins are very thin and small, competition is unfair, and expectations are high, especially if employers are unwilling to pay extra for ethical recruitment. And secondly, as mentioned, there are thin margins, especially in the Hong Kong and Singaporean market. Thin margins makes running a business much more complicated, right? We have 2 of our agencies, the ones that we've invested in, are social enterprises. Our agency in Hong Kong is wholly owned and operated by our foundation, so we're able to get grant funding for the agency to help them through COVID. But there's also limited options for staffing and compensation and benefits, complicating like the talent pool to attracting and retention as well, at least staffing an ethical agency. And with the limited cash flow to adjust to new market challenges and other external factors, during COVID restrictions, new regulations like in Singapore, where agencies are now obligated to reimburse up to 50% of the placement fees if a worker doesn't last 6 months on a job, which forces the market to increase their prices. And the agencies that don't are most likely finding ways to charge the worker to make the regulations financially feasible. So we're seeing like employers that are still very price averse in these markets. And lastly, in our experience in Malaysia, the cost of recruitment is also a major challenge. There's the tangible recruitment costs and the intangible recruitment costs, which are, staff salaries, the labor. These are higher because of inefficient government procedures, manual applications, slow approvals versus in Singapore, which everything is online, which also challenges the post-placement work required for competent hires. Okay. What we know is that in particular, sorry, I'm hearing
Yes,
music.
carry on. Yes, no, you're good. Do continue.
What we know is that Pink Collar has a higher headcount than other traditional agencies because they do need additional labor to sustain things to do the ethical way, right? So all of that are challenges in all 3 markets.
And can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
As an investor, do you find, what's your sense, is it easier if there are, as we're building this new industry, to create new social enterprises? Is that easier than switching from the traditional model to the no fees model?
Could you repeat that? Sorry,
Yes,
the music
of course.
came on.
I'm just curious, is it easier if you're doing this sort of initially as we begin that road toward building the new industry? Is it easier to invest in a new social enterprise, to set up an organization or a company that from the get-go is a no fees model, versus switching the existing recruiters who are currently charging fees to a no fees model? Which one as an investor is an easier approach?
I think for us, at least from our experience, it's only been with existing, early stage enterprises, if not a single proprietor that had not been charging recruitment fees to workers. For us, it was easier because then they understand our mission and values, and we support them through operational expansion and mentorship and advising. I think what will be difficult in transitioning of some group that is from an unethical agency to one that is ethical. I think those existing mechanisms that are in place that might be harder to undo. But Pranay was able to do it, so maybe he can share a bit more of how that was done. But from an investor perspective, at least for us, we don't only put in money, right? We really spend the time and effort and a lot of our knowledge and know-how to support operationally based on our experience. So we provide that as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So that capacity building, we'll come back to that maybe in terms of the accompaniment that's needed. But Pavel, tell us a little bit from your sense of the up close in terms of the challenges of financially viable in the IRIS program, what your experience is of that journey that recruitment agencies have to make to reach that and how it impacts their ability to ethically recruit workers.
Sure, thank you, Anna. We already heard from the recruiter's experience, so maybe I'll try to put the perspective on the other side, the demand side, the employers, and then employee-based principle. So in our experience, where we are working with employers and with the recruiters, we identify a couple of challenges for the financial viability of this. And I won't be saying anything new, and a lot of things will be already, you will hear from me what you already heard today even in the room. But this time we're talking in a financial context, right? So now we are talking money. That's why it's making it exciting a little bit more, right? So one thing is definitely the issue of fees and costs, interpretation, definition, and recognition, right? There's still challenge out there to comprehend which costs actually are the ones that should be absorbed, which are not. There's still a bit of a pick and choose on different files. There's still kind of gray zones which allow to interpret differently, and people saying, well, I do ethical recruitment, I follow employee-based principle. But as we heard from the recruiters, and my colleague Matthias said, well, but we didn't know that it's actually employer pays it all principle, right? So these kind of things are still out there. Solution to this is simple. There's an ILO definition, which says exactly what those costs are, in which circumstances they need to be absorbed, right? Yes, it's a tough one, right? But they was collectively agreed, it was recognized and picked up by IRIS, picked up by RLI, RBA, and all the others, right? And as long as we understand that's the direction of travel, we are committed and we are getting there, it's okay, right? But we need to embrace it, right? So that's one of the challenges which we see, which is actually stumbling block in this one. The other one also related to fees and costs. It's not just about the fees and costs for the uptake of and making it financially viable element. The other element is also on the employer side, who should actually pay those employer pays, who should actually pay those costs as per the employer pays principle. And there's still conversations about it. Is it the direct employer who is doing it, supplier in the context of global supply chains, or should there be also some engagement or participation by the brand behind or the vendor, anybody else higher up in that sense? So that's still there's a challenge, and depending whom you talk to, there's a different understanding related to it. So, but it's really important to crack that nut. Who is participating in absorbing the employee-based principle, those costs, to make sure that this is economically viable model for the employers. And I'll give you one very quick example. I promise not to digress too much, to Anna. Is we've been having a lot of conversations in one of the countries, I won't mention the name of the country, when there's a big movement going on, and then everybody wants to do it, but one part is saying it should be done on the direct employers. Employers saying, well, we would like to do it, but our margins are relatively thin, so we need a bit of a help from above. Well, we can't help you, but you have to still do it, right? So it's a bit more complicated, in that sense, right? But there are also other solutions related to it, right? And help doesn't necessarily always mean putting the money financially. There are different ways, just being smart about it, right? So some considerations related to cracking the nut of the employer-based principle to make it economically viable, from our experience, is it is important to understand, and we spoke about this with Andy during the lunch break, where you recruit the workers from and how do you recruit the workers, right? Because that actually can influence the cost of migration and as well cost of the recruitment, right? In that sense, so that's one element. Then another element, without going too much into details, we can talk about it in later on. And another element also related to the employers to make it financially viable for them is how the recruitment fees and costs can be translated into the services and goods produced with the help of recruited migrant workers, right? And there's unfortunately tendency in thinking out there that shifting the costs of recruitment on the employers will increase significantly the price of goods and services to the consumers, right? The evidence that we see, from the evidence that we see, it looks like that if the recruitment is done smartly and responsibly, this is not actually the case, right? And there's a growing body of evidence that actually doesn't have to be. So there's a big elephant in the room, okay, how do you do it? But yeah, if you look closer, do the proper analysis, plan smartly, something what we heard from IMR, yes, it's a lot of time and investment, but if you do it right at the beginning, then it's possible to do it, and then you benefit from having it right. And to do the recruitment smartly and responsibly, that brings me to my next and last point related to this issue, which is making the economically and financially viable ethical recruitment is not just about the fees and costs. It is about putting in place those systems which we heard from IMR and we heard also from we also heard from Cierto, putting those systems in place by the recruiters but also by the employers to help them optimize the recruitment process. And when we talk about the systems, we are not talking about what William was saying. We are not about the AI, we are not talking about the apps and the other things. We are talking about the simple solutions, simple mechanism which will make the whole process much more efficient and risk-free, right?
So management systems. You know.
Essentially, well, management system is a word which everybody's like, whoa, it sounds super complex, super smart, I don't know. No, we're talking about simple mechanisms, right? Writing down what I do, how I can improve it, just reading it through and saying, okay, how I can improve it. There's a whole body of good tools out there. Yes, to put the system in place, as we heard it from IMR, it's an investment. You need to invest time, you need to invest resources. But what we've been hearing from our work within IOM, not just IRIS, is that actually it pays back, right? And the good thing for the recruiters and employees out there, I would say, is there's really no need at this point of time, unlike it was a couple of years ago, to reinvent the wheel. There's already a whole plethora of good calibrated tools and the solutions already available, and the recruiters, right, whom others can learn from. IMR, Cierto, we heard about recruiters over here. There's recruiters in Africa, there are recruiters in Europe who actually do it, right? And they can tell how to make it work, right? There's really no need to reinvent the wheel. It's just grab it and run with it. I'll just stop here.
That's great, Pavel. And also picking up on your point about not reinventing the wheel and the question of fees and the fact that they change, that's another place where sort of our collective action can really come into play. RBA has a definition of fees. It's based on the ILO. That's a public document, but we need to keep updating it. We also, Verite provides for us a regularly updated labor migration corridor database that provides all of the updated fees. It's updated about every 6 months about the different legal changes in each country, each corridor, and that way it can really inform things like remediation, coming down to the practical, when findings are come to light. Coming back to you, Pranay, I'd love to hear your perspective about how this has been sort of a marketing tool for your organization. The fact that you're an ethical recruiter, how has that helped you?
Okay, to put it simply, what has happened is since we've given up the hybrid model, we are doing it 100% ethically. So when our employers know that it's only the 100% ethical recruitment company that we take up as for the recruitment, that has been an advantage for us. And then the second thing is, like whenever there is a visible event going on, like for example, I can give you an example of UAE Expo 2020, and then there was this Qatar World Cup 2020 that happened. There was a spike of there was a lot of demand of the workers. Like we could come in contact with a lot of employers who wanted to recruit workers ethically. So that was another advantage where we could market ourselves. And it is also saying that identifying the customers, like how we happen to identify customers, like we are more concentrated on the manufacturing companies more, because like manufacturing companies are ones who would be exporting their products from the destination country, and this actually enables and actually emphasizes the employer to follow ethical recruitment. And last but not the least, we've also seen that just as international manpower, when we were transitioning, there has been companies who are approaching us uh, by having transitioned as an ethical recruit, as I believe it is because of the buyers' pressure, and then the media reports on allegation of forced labor, that a lot of companies are shifting towards ethical recruitment for ethical recruitment.
That's great. So follow-up questions. So does that mean that you've become sort of a mentor to others in this space that are looking to you to know how to do it?
Well, in the first thing, like I said, if we are able to lead the chart in terms of deployment, all of the other agencies would certainly want to follow us, and then inspire them to take up this model of ethical recruitment.
That's great. Can I ask one more follow-up question? The challenge that we often find, certainly that I hear from RBA members, is the need to recruit large numbers of workers, and suppliers often having significant times of pressure in manufacturing, needing to produce a product on a short time scale. How does that impact you? Because you're still trying to do it ethically, but are you able to reach that level of scale?
Yes, I must tell you that we've come across employers who has been very generous enough to have only appointed us in some parts where even the recruitment orders are high. And we make it a point, and like I said, we've got a team at International Manpower where we've nurtured, we have cultured, we have spent so much in our team effort, team building effort, that we are able to take up a large number of recruits as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's all hands on deck in that situation. You just get it done. Great. Carmel, over to you. I'm interested to hear from you. We've been talking a lot today about the role of, everyone is needed. Everyone plays a different role in this, to achieve this goal. I'd love to hear from you what you think is needed. From your perspective, what do you need governments to do? What do you need suppliers to do? Investors? What's your call to action?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Anna. I think first, in terms of governments, there's a question around adherence and compliance to international standards, right? You have different both country risks and regulations. And in the case of Hong Kong, there's the market is it's one of the best places for migrant workers to work in. There's high salaries for workers, and most importantly, develop regulatory frameworks, including minimum wage, mandatory rest day, sick leave, maternity leave, etc. There's just issues around law enforcement, and particularly in relation to worker placement fees. In Hong Kong, there's a maximum of 10% worker fees allowed by law, but majority of agencies are still charging more, but very few agencies are reprimanded or have their license revoked. So if more agency licenses were revoked for not following laws, that would also lead to more agencies adopting ethical recruitment practices, we believe. And in Singapore, the biggest influence also would be government, removing the ability to charge workers for placement fees. In that market, it is allowed for agencies to charge up to 2 months of salary, which is again misaligned with regulations from the international standards, and of course clear employment contract terms. Current government mandates contracts for countries of origins do not outline sick leave or terms on public holidays. There's a lot of room for interpretation, causing confusion and making employment relations more vulnerable to tension and also exploitation. And I think secondly, for employers, both individual that we're Of course, we have access to, or that's our majority of our market, is employers for domestic workers. But I guess this also relates to brands and suppliers. It's like awareness raising, right? So a majority of individual employers and brands may not understand the issues with and consequences of unethical recruitment. Employers, if they're therefore don't see the value of engaging ethical recruitment actors, brands need to take their responsibility and ensure ethical recruitment practices of migrant workers as well. This requires brands to look for and support and help grow ethical recruitment through constructive partnerships, I believe. Our challenge is currently at the Honest Jobs level is finding more mission-aligned partners that we can work with to accelerate impact and be able to build a constellation of ethical recruitment enterprises to ultimately transform our industry. And lastly, investors and funders, right? This is the space we occupy, but also ethical actors don't make the same level of profit as their unethical counterparts. It's difficult to attract capital. Majority of impact investors currently are still very focused on commercial returns. Reaching scale is particularly challenging for ethical recruiters, and it's still a nascent industry, and we need support from funders and impact investors to help it grow. I honestly do believe forced labor is a solvable world problem, one that we can solve in our lifetime, and we need to not only identify the bad actors and practices in our industry and be reactionary, but we also need to proactively fund and support the growth of ethical recruitment actors as a preventative measure as well. And so investment and funding the growth and sustainability of ethical recruitment while the market moves towards making responsible recruitment an industry norm is really vital in making this happen.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Carmel. That's very well put. Pavel, over to you in terms of what your call to action is to governments, to employers, to all these different actors to achieve our goal.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start again based on our learnings and trying to make it work. Maybe I'll start with brands. We have a lot of brands or brand representative corporate people here. From our learnings, we need more brands who actually engage and support with the suppliers, right? And less those who are just pushing it on the suppliers, right? In that sense, because it has to work together for the reasons which we already talked about, and I also brought up one example a bit earlier. Also, we are in a slightly different place now, and contrary to the past popular belief that the brands don't have a leverage over the suppliers and the recruiters, from what we are observing and what we see, actually they do, right? And maybe I'm oversimplifying over here, but if in the past the leverage was needed to convince them to do the right thing, now the leverage can be used not to convince necessarily the new ones, but actually to show those who are trying to do the right thing the light in the tunnel. There is a business case for it, right? And I'm saying, but from our experience, we believe that actually they have a leverage because we've been asked and we facilitate a number of engagements or networkings or exposures, for the lack of a better word, and Anna, you know what I'm talking about, between the recruiters to the employers and the big brands and the industry groups behind them. They wanted to hear from them, yes, we want you to do it this way. If you do it this way, you will have a business with us. And that's exactly what we expect you, like point by point. We have I remember from a couple of interventions, and we need you to do it not because it's the right thing to do, because we have to do it. So in order so that we can do it, you also need to do the same thing, right? So though I would not underestimate the power, the leverage of the brands that they have currently over the suppliers and even the recruiters, right? To convince them, look, do the right thing, move on, stay on track, stay on trajectory. There will be a business for you in that sense. And the other aspect also what I wanted to indicate is, well, you talked about no need to reinvent the wheel, there's a lot of tools, but also team up as a brand within the industry and across the industries as well, right? That will increase your leveraging power as well. The other aspect which also might be helpful for the brands is, and we all talked about it, but there's even more emerging, more new coming supply chain due diligence legislation. There's a EU CSDD directive coming up. It's really a big game changer across the board, and really the brands will have to do more than just reporting that something is happening. They will have to show that they have skin in the game in that sense. So that's for the brands. For the suppliers, they would need to, meaning the producers, they would need, and the actual employers, they'll probably need to realistically factor in the recruitment fees and costs and ethical recruitment elements into their procurement decisions, when you talk about the money, which will also influence them to do the smart and responsible way of recruiting. Because if in the past it was like, oh, I just recruit, everything is okay, it doesn't matter from where, I'm not paying anything. Now if they need to pay, they need to be more smart about it. Where do I recruit from? How do I recruit? If I have 5 agents and 7 sub-agents, and everybody has to be compensated, because everybody has to be compensated, or can I actually make it shorter? Maybe direct recruitment is not the way for me, but maybe there are ways to go a bit more smarter about this. The other thing for the suppliers would be as simple as, I know that it sounds simple, but just run consistently fair and ethical business and treat your workers well, right? And we see from our work it pays off because it will be recognized by the employer, your employer clients, by your local governments, which can then, and I'll get to the point what the governments can do about it, but most importantly by the workers. We've witnessed, and I know Cierto and IMR, you guys can also speak to it, if sometimes there is already connection between the employer recruiter and the big brand, but the workers don't trust it because they heard somewhere, and William can speak even more and other colleagues as well, I'm not sure I want to work with this employer. No, there is already growing competition between the countries, between the demand side, right? If you don't do the right thing, the workers will be smart enough and they'll go maybe to another country. They're not necessarily any more desperate to go to this country. And the part of the whole movement of the worker empowerment, worker voice, is to give the workers this agency to say, look, maybe I shouldn't be going anymore working over here. Maybe I can try somewhere else because that's kind of where we are getting here at this point of time. So that's something also to be considered. And when the recruitment is done in a smart way, it does contribute to the reducing the cost of migration, reducing the cost of the recruitment, which will make it more financially viable. And the last piece for the government is we are the intergovernmental organization, IOM. We understand sometimes it's hard to pass the law, right? There's a lot of moving pieces, there's the politics, all the other things, and sometimes passing the law is not the best way to move forward because one law passed, there's always the way to go around it, find a way, and there's also issue with enforcement. And sometimes the stick approach, like our friends from World Employment Confederation call it, is not the best, the most optimal way forward. What we found more effective on the government side is incentivizing good practice, right? Maybe not across the board, but identify the good actors. Maybe not even, you don't have to do it. Just create the incentives for the good practice to encourage good practice and to sustain it in the long run for the recruiters and for the employers. We at IOM, we have the whole menu of different things what it could be. We understand not always all the tools work, but it can do. And the good thing about this in the financial terms is if you incentivize good practice, you get the recognition, people are more encouraged to do the right thing, right? And also you reduce actually the cost of migration. Then more people want to join the club because you prove the concept in that sense as well. Sometimes bilateral agreements can help, but it's not always easy and the best solution because sometimes it takes a lot of time to come up with bilateral agreement which describes the cost, transparency, no more than this. But then if there's no market demand for it, for this agreement to be implemented, then it's not implemented. A lot of time was spent, right? But incentivizing good practice is probably something which does the trick and actually gets the interest from the recruiters and the employers because there's only so much how far they can go on the enthusiasm on doing the right thing. If they see the tangible benefits that they can grasp from doing the right thing, they'll continue doing it and more will come along. It doesn't have to be financial. It can be reduced processing time, right? Or Anna, what you were saying, I need 5,000 workers in a short span of time, right? How do we accommodate for this? It doesn't have to be for free, right? What other things can be done? Stop here.
Great, thanks, Pavel. We have 11 minutes for questions. I believe I've beaten
Wow,
the
11 minutes.
record
That's
so
wonderful.
far.
I'm very excited about this panel, but I resisted sending in questions myself. I have tons. But these are all your questions, which I've roughly clustered around the theme of cost. We have a lot of queries on the issue of cost sharing. We have one that's asking, are there any examples or models where suppliers and buyers or brands or retailers share the cost of transitioning to this more responsible way of recruitment and no longer expect migrant workers to subsidize their cost of operation? On the same theme of cost, we have one that's asking about cash flow, right? For the ethical recruiters, do you have any cash flow problems if you cannot take the fees from the workers straight up. So talk honestly about that. And another one is about fraudulent recruiters. There's a question about whether or not there are people purporting to be ethical. For example, with your partners, Carmel, for the pink collars, is that a problem that you often encounter where people pretend to be, ethical when they're not? And there's a last one. I think, Pava, you're perhaps the best position to address it quickly, is whether or not there's a database of ethical recruiters. So you can take that.
Perennial question.
All right, thank you very much.
If I had a penny for every time I get asked that question, give us the list of the perfect agencies. Carmel, let's come to you. That question of cost and cost sharing, you've had some experience, I think, with that blended finance model. So I'd love to hear from you about that, and then the cash flow, and then also fraudulent recruiters. Maybe you could take all three and we'll go around.
Sure. Just quickly on the cash flow, of course, Ray, as an investor, this is an area we really want to support social entrepreneurs. I mean, we're about to lend additional funding to Pink Collar in their expansion, but also growing their team and this cash flow constraint coming out of COVID, right? And so for us, the repayment model for that is really based on then their placement numbers in the future. So it doesn't also then tie up a fixed rate of a fee or return to Honest Shop. So we're very impact first, slow capital that, recruiters at this stage that are trying to be ethical, that are trying to grow, need this kind of patient capital. And the question around ethical or recruiters pretending to be ethical. Our model really in terms of our investment criterias and our due diligence process is working with, of course, our pro bono lawyers to vet out our network and agencies. And really the investment model for us is kind of a way for us to be able to have insights into our agencies that we invest in. So we have a board seat, we have access to their records and financials, and are able to then also veto work orders when we have that as part of our shareholder structure and agreements. And so this is for us important and not just helping in the early stages, capacity building, but really a long-term investment to really guide the entrepreneur and the recruiter into fair and ethical and sustainable practices. And again, we also follow IRIS standards. None of our agencies currently are IRIS certified, but our Hong Kong agency here, Fair Employment Agency, has been part of the capacity building and also the mock audit. And so some of those learnings and also tools we've implemented across our investees until such time they're large enough and have operational support to really be IRIS certified. So we are looking forward to having that as part of the model as well.
Fantastic, Carmel, thank you. Pranay, over to you. And those questions, just as a reminder, were about the cost sharing between suppliers and brands. Have you seen any models there, cash flow and fraudulent recruiters?
Yes. Okay. When we are talking about cash flow, yes, we've come across a lot of employers who are still traditional at mind, who would try and delay the payments. But of course, we would appeal all the employers to pay us in advance. That would be very nice because we are running on a very small profit. So our service fee is very small. So in that context, also you could understand. And of course, I would also urge the buyers and then the investors to actually put extra emphasis on the ethical recruitment, in the sense that especially their franchise, their subsidiaries in the supply chains, especially in the countries where they hire a lot of migrant workers. And as for the fraudulent ethical recruiters, as for the fraudulent recruitment agencies is concerned, I would like to put it in a very simple manner. Simple manner in the sense that if an employer should be willing to pay all the recruitment cost and let the agency know that he has got a lot of orders coming in from behind on the later stage, definitely, be it any agency, they would try their best to not take fees from the workers, as because all of the agencies across the world would like to have a sustainable business. So I believe it is not just always the agencies that create an issue. Of course, it has to be from the top level as well.
Thank you for that reminder, Pranay. That's a very important point. Pavel, over to you on the question of, is there a database of ethical recruiters?
Yeah,
Where is it?
So let's put it simply. Yes, there is a list. There's more than one list. Is it public? No. Right? From the publicly available information, you have a list of certified recruiters, not just two IRIS. I just learned greatly, but we have 2 recruiters certified. Can I say it, Andy? 2 recruiters certified in Myanmar to on the level. There are also 2 recruiters certified in the US, I believe, or to Clearview. We have 1 IRIS certified recruiter, another one in the pipeline, which is also available public information on the IRIS certification website. So that's about it, what is in the public domain, right? We do know that there is a list of good recruiters, but really the good ones who are doing the right thing, not just on paper, right? It's not public. There's plenty of reasons why it's not public. There's plenty of conversations. Should it be public? Should it be not public? Should it be partially public or not? I'm looking at William and a couple of other folks. We've been having a lot of, it's an ongoing conversation now that we are not there yet. But I would also flip the question, because that's how we perceive it. Do we have a list of good employers as well? Because actually, let's not forget, it takes 2 to tango to make it work, right? You might have a good recruiters, but they will be out of business. You have a big list of good recruiters, but the list may be completely outdated, and recruiters can be out of business if there's no equally like-minded thinking employers, not the big brands, but the clients of those recruiters, right? And in that perspective, for us, what's important is the goal is not to have recruiters certified, right? The goal is for the ethical recruiters to sustain their business. And certification or any kind of other recognitions, for the lack of a better word, is the means to help them sustain those businesses, right? And for them to sustain those businesses, they need to have the employers on the same page. We just spoke about this again with Andy over lunch. You need to have those employers because and they need to be there for good and also committed, because you might very easily have a situation where they have certified recruiter. If 2 years down the line, the project is over, the employees moved on somewhere else, they're out of business. And they actually have more to lose than to gain, right? So it's a longer version. The quick version is, yes, there are lists, there's even more than one list. It's not, is it public? No, it's not. But let's also think about the really, for real, a good list of the employees as well. And then we can start connecting them both together. And if it works, then we can publicly showcase the good work done.
And yeah, thank you for bringing us back to that question of demand. I'll say for the Responsible Recruitment Program, there is a list. There's a list of what we call participating recruitment agencies, and that's public on the Responsible Business Alliance website. And so that leads us to a challenge of there needs to be that ongoing verification, right? So there might be a list, but you need to continually update it, continually make sure that that they're continually participating in some form of capacity building and or audit. I believe that's all we have time for. I have 1 minute left. Bonnie, should we see if there's other questions, or should we wrap up exactly on time? What would you prefer? Do you want to bring one of your questions, Bonnie, then?
One of my questions. Wow. Which one do I pick? Okay, so I'll pick this, and it's something that Carmel and I have been discussing. She laughs at 2 a.m. Hong Kong time. So my question is, cross-border migration is difficult, right? Because we're dealing with different regulations. We need people who understand specific challenges, in the corridors, and that's differentiated by sector. Oftentimes further differentiated by, gender and the people doing the work. Ethical recruiters oftentimes, we struggle with building this network, right? Of a network of people who can learn from each other, of just talking to each other and doing this. I know in the context of Taiwan, where it's hard to find ethical recruiters in the country of origin, and that's further divided by the sector of work we're looking at. So my question to you is, how can we expedite this process, so that we can ensure that the integrity of the whole migration corridor in terms of responsible recruitment is maintained?
Brilliant question. Carmel?
I don't know if that's a question for me, but yes. Hi, Bonnie. Nice to hear your voice. I think what's been great about Honest Jobs is, recruiters have been coming out of the woodworks and kind of creating this network of ethical recruiters to really learn from each other. And our investee out of Singapore was really more interested, yes, of course, the monetary support and guidance, but he wanted to have a team to talk to and share insights and challenges, because you're working with people crossing borders and you deal with a lot of daily interactions with both workers and employers that are abrasive, sad, and all these things that you need mentorship and guidance, and also other people's in the market that understand, and you're not alone in the journey as an ethical recruiter. And I think this is important in terms of, creating spaces like this, inviting folks like myself, Pranay, and maybe in the future other recruiters to share their experiences. And I mean, Joe's in the audience at CRTO, so like we found each other also, and we talk collectively. And I think expanding that ecosystem, you need more funding, more support, all these things that we've talked about on this call. And I think we're looking for each other to share these insight challenges, and how do we create opportunities to move past some of these challenges, because we've learned from other markets. What we're learning as an ecosystem, and as we're building that ecosystem, and I'm learning from Singapore, Malaysia, we're able to actually disrupt and transform our sector, because we're not starting from scratch, but we're learning as we go. And there's other people to learn from. And I've learned from Pranay and other folks. So I think that's what's really needed, is for us to meet each other and to share challenges and support the growth of ethical recruiters.
That's fantastic. Carmel, we'll let you have that last word. Really, really appreciate you. Thank you, Pranay, as well, for being up so incredibly late at night or early in the morning. Thank you for sharing your experiences and allowing us to learn from you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pavel, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to sit on the end.
Let's hope Rosie pops up.
A brief interview session, slightly different format. There's only 2 panellists. For those of you joining online, my name's Louise Herring. I'm Executive Director of AIM Progress, a collaborative network of fast-moving consumer goods brands and their suppliers working together on human rights. So this session we're going to focus in on a slightly different topic. We're going to talk about fraudulent job schemes. And just to set the scene in terms of what we're going to be talking through, very specifically we're talking about false offers of employment. So workers who are paying money for false or non-existent jobs. And those kind of schemes globally funnel millions of dollars a year into the pockets of fraudulent recruiters. It's a type of fraud that is widespread, that harms families and communities and pushes victims into poverty and debt. It's illegal in the majority of countries, but these practices are proliferating at an alarming rate. And what we're seeing is increased complexity, fueled by a lot of the things we've talked about already today: high demand for migrant workers, little transparency, and under-regulated labour recruitment markets. So today we're going to zone in on two particular examples of these fraudulent job schemes. One in the UK, so James is going to introduce that, and then one in Malaysia, which Rosie, who's joining us virtually from the UK, is going to talk about. Rosie Hurst from Impact. James, can I ask you to start us off to introduce yourself and give us a picture of what fraudulent jobs look like in the countries that Proforce operate in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I've been granted 3 minutes, so Pavel's luxury of 5 is been well surpassed. So I'm James Malik, I'm Compliance Director at Proforce. We're the UK's largest agricultural recruiter, supplying circa 27,000 workers a year into the UK labour market. Historically, pre-Brexit, and I'm not going to get into that conversation, but I'm certainly on the Remain side. Historically, we have recruited those workers from the UK or from Europe where freedom of movement existed. And more recently, we've then had to go further afield, and Proforce are one of 6 approved licence holders in the UK that can sponsor seasonal workers. Our recruitment is done by ourselves in the vast majority of cases, and as a result of the Ukraine invasion, where the majority of our recruitment was happening for the seasonal worker scheme, we've had to move slightly further afield to mainly Central Asia, which will be about 85% of our seasonal workers this year. So I think in terms of just defining what we see, there's probably 3, if I'm going to simplify it, 3 key aspects. One is that genuine fraudulent activity, either by passing off, so taking branding of a genuine recruiter, saying there is a job available, asking for a payment online. The job does not exist. The worker doesn't know this, and we find out about it when the worker contacts us sometime later and says, "Where's my job?" And this is the first we've heard of it. But there's also agencies operating with their own branding that don't actually offer a job at the end of it. Then there's this sort of hybrid in the middle where a recruiter is saying, "I've got jobs," and effectively what they do is just introduce the individual to the genuine recruiter. Little does the genuine recruiter know. Or, in some cases, they just give them the advert for that job and ask them to apply. And then, slightly off topic, but I think equally important, what we also see is a service industry popping up around it, offering services that aren't required. So, for example, in Central Asia, that'll be visa support. In Central Asia, we work with labour ministries of the country, and the worker is supported to make their visa application by Proforce and by the Labour Ministry. By the time they know that, it's too late, because they haven't been to our website, and they haven't been to one of our recruitment events. They aren't in our process, but they've already paid. So I think, at a base level, they're the 3 key sort of sectors of where we see this issue happening.
Great, thank you, James. I think that's very clear. Rosie, welcome. Rosie is in unseasonably warm London. It's not something that we're used to. So it's probably about 10 o'clock at night and 28 degrees. Rosie, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself to the room and give us the same perspective that James has of what have you seen, what has Impact seen of what this looks like in Malaysia?
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Rosie Hurst, founder of Impact, and we do a lot of work on migrant worker issues with a specific focus on remedy. And I just wanted to share a quick insight into other aspects of criminality, bribery and corruption, which are often rather shadowy, and we often actually can't see what's going on. We have these suspicions of kickbacks, bribery and corruption. There's a case that we were working on in Malaysia recently where we were able to get information from a lot of WhatsApps in order to understand who was paying what for whom, who's paying whom for what along the labour supply chain, and it was very instructive. So what we found, for example, was that the employer in this case was paying $550 per worker to be recruited from Nepal. The Malaysian agent simply pocketed all of that money and charged a Nepali agent $780 per worker, so that you can see how much per worker the Malaysian agent is making. But and to say more than that, the workers each pay between $3,000 and $4,000. So you can kind of understand a little bit how this starts to work. But then you factor in all the kickbacks. So how is this money being passed along, and what is it being spent on? So these trails of WhatsApp messages showed improper relations with police, improper relations with the labour ministries, very cosy relationships, lunches and things like that with decision makers, but also the use of prostitutes, a lot of detail about the use of prostitutes, as well as 5-star trips for employers and a lot of other stuff as well. So that starts to unpack what is really going on when we look particularly at Part C of the ILO definition of fees and charges. Now, our suspicion is it's very unusual to have this level of information, but our suspicion is the majority of, shall we say, virgin labour supply chains this is how they work. So the kind of practice that was being described, the emerging best practice that we had described in the last session, is a kind of drop in this much more sinister ocean. I feel that often many of the technical guides don't linger sufficiently on the issue of corruption, kickbacks and criminality. And I think it's time that we all understood a lot more about where those opportunities of corruption are, and how we can improve due diligence to root it out. That was my little intro, Louise.
Thank you, Rosie. That's super. Can I ask you to kind of continue on that theme? I mean, you've started to talk about root causes. You've started to talk about the criminality and where that's coming from. As much as you can in that Malaysia case, you know, what do we know, do we not know about the root causes of that case, and how far was there able to be kind of transparency of where this criminality was starting from?
Well, we were very lucky in that we had a very supportive supply chain, a very supportive employer in this case, from very supportive retailers and brands also, who genuinely wanted to try and find out about this rather than rushing to punishment. And I think that's very important because, you know, as we know in this field, understanding the diagnostic, really understanding this stuff helps you to tackle the root causes. I think there are several interesting points here. Often there's a lot of blame put on the source country, because it's said it's the source country where all the illegality is. It's the source country where there isn't good governance. But what we're seeing here is a large amount of...
Oh, hang on one sec, Rosie. We've lost your sound. I don't know if you can hear me. Possibly not. Okay. James, could you seamlessly slot into that question? I don't know if Rosie will keep talking. Have we got Rosie's sound back at all? No?
Not yet.
Okay.
Rosie, if you get sound back, please just come back in.
You can interrupt James as if you were in the same room as him.
Yeah.
James, can you talk about the kind of UK cases that you've seen in the same way that Rosie was explaining, you know, what do we know about where that criminality comes from? What do we not know?
Yeah.
How does that work for the UK?
I think we've touched on the root causes probably a couple of times today. Certainly Rebecca identified it in her keynote speech at the start. And I think it's not new. Yesterday I went to the Ellis Island Migration Museum, and the root causes were true then. And that is a real desire of migrants to improve their lives. You know, the opportunity to come and work in the UK on seasonal agricultural work from Central Asia genuinely represents 10 to 20 times improved net income per year on a return basis every year. That is, you know, massive. It genuinely is huge. And that's one of the root causes. You know, that is shiny gold, I think was the phrase that was used earlier, in the workers' eyes. You know, that is that desire to go and improve their own standing at home, the standing and lives of their children. You know, and I think that is fundamentally creating that opportunity. And unfortunately what happens, and what we see quite often in the fraudulent adverts, is not only does the job not exist, it's being presented as one of the best jobs. It is the shiny gold, it's the best, it's the highest income. And it's not just, you know, maybe the recruiter's advert that's being passed off. Sometimes we're actually seeing now the end employer is being passed off on that fraudulent advert. And you know, with the advent of social media, workers are more connected than they've ever been. So workers also understand where the best job is. And when that job pops up as an advert, you know, that's where the root cause comes from. Rosie, have we got you back if I'm...
Can we try you again, Rosie?
Still nothing?
No. Still no
Um,
sound.
So yeah,
Okay.
so in terms of
we can move on, James. We'll
no,
come
no,
back
no,
to the
fine,
criminality
fine.
with,
And I'm
Rosie.
like, if I've got a few more moments, then you know, I'd just like to unpack that a little bit more. So there is a real desire, and that's creating the opportunity. With opportunity comes, you know, great income. So what a worker may be paying one of the fraudulent adverts is more than we get paid by our customer to do the recruitment properly. And we don't charge the workers for any of our services whatsoever. So, you know, that is the potential income. We run a very viable, commercially profitable business, but we are charging less than the criminals. You know, so the opportunity to earn money for a criminal is huge. And also it happens usually in an environment that is really uncontrollable. So, you know, it happens in a country that is not part of the scheme. It's probably not the source country. You know, we you know, have heard of you know, some of the progressions around AI, and the opportunity for that to expand and explode is really quite concerning.
If people haven't read, I'm sure a lot of people in the room have, but if people haven't read The Fourth Time We Drowned, or The Fourth Time I Drowned, it's a journalist account of migrants' journeys from Libya and the surrounding areas to the UK. Yes, if you want to explore more about the root causes of this criminality, it's a fairly dark read, I think, but a very kind of real one. I'm going to go on to the, I don't know whether to try Rosie's sound again. Rosie, do you want to try talking to us? Nothing. Okay, all right. James, let's move on to what can be done. Let's talk about in these cases, so it's obviously something your business has experienced, these cases of fraudulent jobs. What can be done? What do you think is the role of businesses like your own? What is the role of the sending and receiving governments? What's the role of other stakeholders? Because, I mean, I can see, and I know I've worked with businesses in the UK that have been subject to this same fraud. It's hard to know what role business has in this. To some extent, it's not your responsibility, but on the other hand, obviously it's impacting upon workers, and you want to do something from a moral perspective. So, yeah, what are the things that you think business and other stakeholders should be doing?
Sorry, is it Mark? Yeah, in your session earlier, you referenced sort of worker knowledge, and I think that's really important. You know, these things are very, very difficult, probably impossible to fix from a recruiter's point of view or from an end user's point of view, because it's criminal activity. So what you have to rely on is worker knowledge to make informed decisions. And if a worker can make an informed decision, they're less likely to decide to make a payment online for a job that doesn't exist, because they know that they don't need to pay for a job because the recruiter, who's the genuine one, isn't charging them. So as businesses, you know, I think what we have to do is invest in educating workers. And that's then quite a difficult commercial discussion, I can assure you, because we have to kind of approach that from a point of view of educating everybody, even if they might not apply. If you take Central Asia, for example, you know, in the 3 countries that we source from predominantly, total population is probably about 60 million. We might recruit 6,000 workers from there this year. So how do you fund a worker project around education or around increasing knowledge when you're talking to a lot of people? And so therefore, you know, you have to do a number of things. So, you know, we work with the labour ministries in those countries, and they have a real responsibility to also take proactive action to educate workers. And that's being done through some collaboration we've had with the IOM, where we've written pre-departure training, which is now being rolled out by the Labour Ministry. So workers are getting genuine, proper, clear, concise information about the seasonal worker scheme. I think it goes slightly further than that in terms of what else can be done, because again, it's a bit too late if it's done by the migration centre, because the worker's already in the process. So you have to go one step further. For example, if you went to our website, it would tell you don't pay any work-finding fees. If you came to one of our recruitment sessions, it would tell you don't pay work-finding fees. If you go to our social media pages, it says don't pay work finding fees. Workers are paying work finding fees because all those things come too late. So what we're trying to do now is create some open source information that's just more widely available. One of those things is the Just Good Work app, which we've been investing in and funding from a sort of recruiter's point of view now since 2021 when we first translated it to Ukrainian, because that was one of our key source countries. And then over the last couple of years, retailers and users of the seasonal worker scheme in the UK.
Well, now I hope you get it back in time for you.
And operators. Are we back? And
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you, Rosie.
Oh, good. We were chatting
We can
in the green room because we can hear what you're doing. We were worried about whether we're back on for the next session, but it sounds to be on. Sorry, James, you carry on.
No problem. Yeah. So if I can just make a couple more points, and then Rosie, all the time is yours. So we've invested in Just Good Work app. Retailers, operators, recruiters have come together to fund that. It now has a specific seasonal worker section, and it's open source, it's free. So what we're now trying to do is publicize that so that workers go there before they come to us. So they can get factual information on there, they can check, is this a genuine recruiter? We've built a worker information video for the Gangmaster Labour Abuse Authority, which is just launched in the UK this week, and the translated versions come out next week, where we have workers talking about their experience of the scheme. The fact that they didn't have to pay work finding fees to come into the scheme, that when they're on farm, what their accommodation is like, what the work is like. Working in agriculture, and I know because I've done it, is tough. In the UK, the weather is wet a lot of the time, and sometimes it's really hot, and then it's wet again a lot of the time. I felt quite at home here last night. And so it's about kind of getting one step ahead, one step earlier in the process. And that GLAA video hopefully is going to form part of that.
Thanks, James. And can I just, a quick follow-up question, and then I'll come to you, Rosie, because we don't want to lose you again. But Rosie said in her introduction about bribery and corruption, and that takes us into a different realm. Have you found that in relation to the fraudulent jobs that your business have identified that the government in the UK have engaged in that problem and been supportive of it? If you can diplomatically answer that one, or we might just take your...
So I think probably in the UK, the environment with the seasonal worker scheme is quite different. We're approved as a sponsor, and our welfare responsibilities are there throughout the course of the programme. So when a worker is on farm, if the farm does something wrong, we are responsible. Even though they're not working on our farm, we're just the recruiter. But legally, we're responsible for their welfare. And I think we've seen much of this has fallen to the operators. And there are some great NGOs that have been involved. And in the UK, as a result of some of the poor media coverage that was, and some of the reporting that we had in 2022, there's a seasonal worker task force that's been convened by a number of NGOs, retailers, the operators, and government bodies, who are now really sort of collaborating and talking openly about some of the challenges. And I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, great.
If that diplomatically answers your question.
That's very diplomatic. Well done, you. Rosie, let's go to you then on the question that I addressed to James in terms of what can be done about these fraudulent job schemes. So we were talking about the different actors. Hopefully you could hear us of, the labour providers. James gave the perspective of what they've done to try and tackle the risks. But also, obviously, there is a government both sending and receiving government role. So what is your perspective on how we try and tackle this criminality? Should we try and tackle this criminality, and who should be doing what?
Yes, absolutely. We must remember that it is the workers who are the victims of the criminality. So it's important that we do not forget that it is vital to deliver remedy to those workers, whether the fees and charges and payments they have made fall under A, B, or C in the ILO definitions. So I would urge all stakeholders to ensure that we don't get muddled up and worry about companies being victims here. It is the workers who are victims, not the companies. So we must start with remedy for workers. Then we need to redouble all efforts on due diligence. And James has spoken in some ways about this, but we need to remember that all the time, because we're fishing in such a polluted sea, all the time we should be looking to remedy those problems which we find. So, in most of the cases we work on, the recruitment that occurs after we have delivered remedy probably is able to reduce fees, the fees and charges paid by workers by 60%, which means that workers are still paying 40%, and that must be paid back to workers. And indeed, we find it is delivering that remedy which acts as the spur to enforcing proper due diligence and eliminating fraudulent job schemes, and as well as kickbacks and other corrupt activities. So I start with the worker, and I start with remedy of the worker. And I think that is where we need to make sure that we don't forget why we're doing this in the first place. Why we're doing this in the first place is to ensure a supply of legally recruited non-paying workers into our farms, factories, all over the world. And at the moment, the people who are funding that are workers. And that is where we need to start when it comes to sorting this out.
Thanks, Rosie. In the case, if I can just pick up on your point there about remedy for workers, in the case that James described, where actually the worker is applying for a job that doesn't exist, the recruitment organisation aren't linked to that job that's being offered, the employer isn't being linked to that job, where from your experience can the remedy come from in that example? Or where should it come from in your view?
Where should it come? I mean, I think that there needs to be swifter action in identifying these fraudulent schemes. Because obviously having something purporting to be you, it's very important that companies start to crawl all over Facebook, because you can find these things by simply Googling in order to stop them before they start. I think that it's important, for example, to take cases in local courts. And I think it might also be important for, at country and market level, for there to be remedy funds established. Because otherwise, I mean, there needs to be a way of cutting this off at the source without further penalising workers. So the workers that James is talking about have lost out a huge amount of money, their families are deeply indebted. And we can't allow that to happen on the basis of promises of jobs and possibly insufficient due diligence. So I just repeat, we need to really sharpen up. And I'm sure, James, this year that won't happen again because we're much more on your toes than we were last year and the year and indeed the year before that. And we all need to make sure we are much more on our toes. But we need to clear up the mess that we have made.
Thanks, Rosie. And James, I mean, do you want to add to that one in terms of who should remedy in those cases? What's your view?
I think it's quite a challenging one, particularly in the UK at the moment, because of I've touched already on the fact that the amount of fees that are being levied by the criminal exceed what we charge the client to do it properly. They're just, from our perspective, there isn't that sufficient income from the supply chain, and that probably then comes down to consumers. In the UK, we've become very used to cheap food in the main, and maybe that's where there needs to be some consideration.
Great, thank you. Listen, thank you both of you for giving us an insight. Thank you, Rosie, for bearing with us through the technical issues. I think what we've talked about in terms of this criminality, the scale and the depth of those issues is beyond really what we've got time to discuss today, and I think does take us into a different area of bribery and corruption that is very complex. We know there's an enormous amount of money, as James has highlighted, to be made from fraudulent recruitment, and with more people on the move than ever before, unfortunately, it's a risk that we're going to see more of. So thank you, Rosie and James, for bringing that issue to life, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Hold on just 1 second. I spilled water. I'll be right back.
Oh.
I go ahead and start. I'm sorry. I'm a little unclear. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. This is a little hard.
Oh no.
Since I can't see you, let's go ahead and get started. I'm so sorry that I am not there with you in person. I had planned to be, but life got in the way. So anyway, I wish I could see you all, but thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon and good morning to Rashid. I know it's early there for Rashid in Malaysia. My name is Neha Mishra, and I am the global lead for migration and human trafficking at the Solidarity Center. The Solidarity Center is the largest US-based international worker rights organization, helping workers attain safe and healthy workplaces, family-supporting wages, dignity on the job, widespread democracy, and greater equity at work and in their community. I want to thank IHRB for inviting me to moderate this panel and for including this important topic of repayment and remediation of fees to workers. While we are focused specifically on remediation of recruitment fees on this panel, our conversation will necessarily cover remediation of all sorts for worker rights violations for migrant workers all along supply chains. As noted by Fair Square in their important 5 corridors report, unfair recruitment practices may begin when workers have to pay exorbitant fees, but they ripple through the life cycle of a work contract, leaving workers acutely vulnerable to trafficking and forced labor. 10 of the ILO's 11 indicators of forced labor link directly or indirectly to unfair recruitment. Yet, while commitments to eradicate trafficking and modern slavery from supply chains abound, functioning models of ethical recruitment are few and far between. That was a quote from the report. I'm so pleased that we all agree on the employer's pay principle. If we had talked 15 years ago, that may not have been the case. So while we agree on that, I'm hoping we can agree on this next thing. This principle will mean nothing unless there is a robust and fair system for repayment and remediation of fees and other violations of migrant worker rights in the migration process, in the workplace, and all along supply chain. We found consensus around the employer's pay principle. I now hope that we can find consensus on centering of worker agency in the remediation process. First and foremost, to achieve this goal, we must ensure that workers are centered in the remediation process. The key players are not only governments and employers and, quote, other stakeholders. Migrant workers are not other stakeholders. As recognized by the International Labor Organization, workers are on equal footing with governments and employers in industrial relations. And in terms of repayment and remediation, the affected workers must have their agency recognized. We must recognize not only worker voice, but migrant worker agency. Migrant workers have agency, including collective agency, to ensure fair remediation for recruitment fees and other violations. Worker representatives must be involved in the decision-making process before any remediation package is finalized and implemented. I hope by the end of this panel, we can all agree on that principle as well. Within this context, I'm pleased to introduce, we have 3 panelists for today to talk about their experiences on remediation. Excuse me. I'm not going to read their full bios, but just do a little bit of an introduction. First, we're going to hear from Anasuya Sham. Anasuya is the Human Rights and Trade Policy Director at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. She leads the Human Trafficking Legal Center's initiative on import bans and forced labor. Anasuya works with pro bono counsel, civil society groups, government, and other stakeholders to push for greater accountability through the enforcement of the U.S. Tariff Act and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act import prohibitions. Next, we are going to hear from Rashid Reza Anwaruddin. He is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Sim Darby Plantation. He was appointed Head of Group Sustainability of Sim Darby in January of 2020. In this role, he was responsible for implementing on-the-ground programs to promote responsible and ethical production through Sim Darby's operations and global supply chain. He also engages with a wide range of stakeholders within the sustainable palm oil sphere. He was redesignated as Chief Sustainability Officer in April of 2022. He has 22 years of experience in corporate and advisory roles around sustainability, corporate responsibility, corporate strategy, program management, and change management across the plantation, forestry, property, telecommunications, automotive, oil and gas, and public sectors. And then finally, we're going to hear from Agnieszka, Raznitska. She's the Migration Program Coordinator for Fundación Avena. Agnieszka is a human rights specialist with 25 years of progressive experience, driving strategies for civil society organizations to support human rights advocacy initiatives, activism, and more inclusive and participatory philanthropy. She has worked on projects centered on community development strategies, social impact, and facilitating cross-sector partnerships that drive innovative approaches to advance society within civil society and philanthropy. So as I said, I'm very excited that we have all 3 panelists with us here today. And I think we're going to start with Anasuya in the room. Anasuya?
Thank you, Neha, and I hope my mic is working and I'm audible. So my remarks will focus on the progress and challenges in the import ban space, import bans against products made using forced labor in global supply chains. As part of the Human Trafficking Legal Center's activities, we focus quite a bit on how we can leverage trade measures like import bans to improve conditions across the supply chain. And this is in part because of a recent resuscitation of Section 307 of the US Tariff Act of 1930. This happened in 2015 through an amendment under the Obama-Biden administration. And through that amendment, we were able to see how US Customs and Border Protection has been able to enforce this law, issue import bans, or what we call withhold release orders, against a host of products and actors from different parts of the world for using forced labor in US supply chains. So just to give you a picture of enforcement to set the stage, so since 2015, since the amendment went into force under Section 307 of the US Tariff Act, Customs and Border Protection has issued 35 import bans or withhold release orders prohibiting goods from certain companies and regions from entering the US market. This includes apparel, fish, electronics, tobacco, palm oil, rubber gloves, and I'm sure we'll hear more from the other panelists on some of these particular products in the context of certain countries. So while the import prohibitions are just the first step, I think what we're all really interested to see is how forced labor remediation follows in this process. So, but before that, I do want to bring your attention to just some statistics to show why we are all interested in this space, why the Human Trafficking Legal Center has been so focused on issuing guidance to other organizations to engage with this tool, to engage with US Customs and Border Protection, to share evidence of forced labor from wherever they're working around the world. And we published a guide in 2020 called Importing Freedom, using the US Tariff Act to combat forced labor and supply chains, and we've translated it into a bunch of languages, including Bahasa Malay, Thai, French, and Spanish. So in fiscal year 22, US Customs and Border Protection targeted more than 2,400 shipments valued at $466 million because of forced labor concerns. Now this is a big statistic compared to fiscal year 2018, when US Customs and Border Protection detained only 6 shipments. So we've seen this sort of meteoric rise in enforcement, and with that, we've seen CBP, US Customs and Border Protection, engage more and more on issues of forced labor remediation. So as more companies are being targeted by this law, as more companies have their shipments blocked at port, we're seeing both Customs and Border Protection, the companies that are targeted, and also civil society kind of engage together to make sure that the workers who we want to be, who we wish to see as the ultimate beneficiaries of the law, actually see improvements on the back of Tariff Act enforcement. So a company that's targeted by an import ban or a withhold release order can petition US Customs and Border Protection to get itself removed from the withhold release order and resume exporting to the US market. But to do so, it has to show that it has remediated all the ILO indicators of forced labor that Customs and Border Protection has identified before issuing the import prohibition. So the US Customs and Border Protection generally follows the ILO framework in assessing and categorizing the evidence of forced labor it receives from petitioners around the world. And then it determines whether each of those indicators have been remediated. Now, recently, in the last, I think, 6 months, Customs and Border Protection has removed certain entities from various import bans as a result of the evidence they presented on forced labor remediation. And most notably, this has happened, of course, in the Malaysian context, and I see many experts in the room who can probably speak to the details on what's happening in Malaysia. But just to give you a sense of the reimbursement that has happened around recruitment fee payments in the Malaysian glove industry and the palm oil industry. In a CBP press release a couple of months ago, the agency mentioned that CBP's forced labor enforcement efforts have resulted in the improvement of living and working conditions for tens of thousands of workers, including the repayment of more than 50 million in withheld wages and recruitment fees that were used to trap workers in debt bondage. Of course, I think there has also been a ripple effect. Even though there are only certain industries or certain companies that have been targeted under a withhold release order, we've seen other players in the same industry take proactive steps to ensure that they are not subject to a withhold release order. So maybe others, including I'm seeing Andy Hall, might have the latest figures in terms of reimbursement. But this 50 million is significant because it has happened on the back of US Tariff Act enforcement. Now, the Human Trafficking Legal Center is part of a coalition of organizations called the Tariff Act Advisory Group. I see a few members here. Hi, Sean. And we together we advocate for more robust enforcement of these import bans to make sure that we can enhance its impact. And in 2020, we did write a letter to US Customs and Border Protection. We write letters, we make recommendations on how forced labor enforcement can be done in a better way. And in 2020, we wrote a letter specifically on reimbursement of recruitment fee payments. And in 2020, I think that was the beginning of a slew of withhold release orders against gloves and palm oil in Malaysia. And we realized that all of the negotiations around reimbursements were taking place, and we were worried that maybe the numbers might be too narrow, that this exercise will be viewed in a really narrow way without taking into account the broader context of forced labor remediation and ultimately remedy to workers held in forced labor in those contexts. So in this letter, we made a few recommendations, and I just want to note a couple of them. The first one is that we urge the agency to to think of recruitment fees in a broader context. We urged the agency to also consider whether they can require the company that's been targeted by a withhold release order to pay liquidated damages along with the principal amount of the recruitment fees to account for all the incidental costs around recruitment when the workers first applied and paid these fees. Because what we realized is there was a sort of patchwork of recruitment fee payments flowing out to workers depending on nationality, depending on which corridors they use, and a host of other factors. So that was one of our recommendations based on similar provisions under a US law, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Another recommendation was that we urge the agency to look at the date from which these calculations are made. That this has to be a date certain in the past. It cannot be arbitrary, and ideally it should be from the time that company first started hiring migrant workers, foreign migrant workers. And then one big issue was that of staggered repayment. So in the beginning, we saw very staggered repayment plans, often spread across 2 or 3 years, and then we pushed the agency to make sure that these payments go out in lump sum and not as staggered repayments. So these were a few of our recommendations, and we continue advocating on many of these issues, especially at congressional hearings. The Human Trafficking Legal Center recently testified at a few hearings on forced labor issues, and we did raise these issues on forced labor remediation. In conclusion, and I know there's going to be robust discussion later on, I think I do want to end by saying that recruitment fees, in our perspective, is one of the most pervasive forms of exploitation in global supply chains. It is a gateway to more indebtedness and forced labor, but the reimbursement exercise of recruitment fees should not be seen in a vacuum. It should occur in a larger context of remediation, which is full payment of back wages and other earned compensation, reimbursement for costs incurred on the job, reimbursement for forced overtime, regularization of immigration status, among others. And it is our position, and this is going back to what Neha mentioned at the outset, workers and worker representatives and independent unions must be involved in the decision-making process, including the very design and implementation of the remediation packages that are finalized under the Tariff Act processes. And with that, I turn it back to Neha.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. I love when panelists stick to their time. You guys are wonderful. And I know we had a planning call, so we're on it. Rashid, we're very excited to hear from you. And I think we all just owe Rashid a big thanks, because I think it's like 3 o'clock in the morning. He's in KL, in Kuala Lumpur, I think, in Malaysia, and it's very early. So Rashid, thank you so much for being with us so early in the morning. Please, go ahead.
Thanks, Meha, and thanks to the IHRB for inviting us to share some of our experience around ethical recruitment and also the sort of experience that we've had in the past couple of years in implementing repayment of recruitment fees. So we'd just like to share our experience and some of the practical challenges that are happening on the ground with regards to implementing some of these things. So I mean, there's a few points that I wanted to get through today at the start of this session. The first one is essentially, I'll probably give a quick overview of ourselves and our operations, just to give a bit of context of where we are coming from. Then I'll touch a bit about the process that we did with regards to the reimbursement of the recruitment fees of our existing workers, and also some of our ex-workers as well. And also I'll touch a bit also about some of the enhancements that we've made to our ethical recruitment processes. So just to start, to just give you an overview and context to the people here today, Sun Nabi Plantation, we are mainly a palm oil company. We operate across the entire value chain of palm oil, but the majority of our operations are in the upstream operations, which is essentially the estates and mills. And basically, if you just zoom down to our Malaysian operations, this is basically where the sort of risk of forced labor is highest, because in Malaysia itself, in total we have more than 20,000 workers in Malaysia, and at one point in time, up to 80% of the workers are migrant workers coming from more than 6 different nationalities. So that we actually have quite a significant amount of migrant workers who are working with us, and on an annual basis, we actually get in the thousands of workers coming in on an annual basis from these different corridors. So we actually previously already had a zero cost recruitment policy back in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. But what we found out was, when we conducted an assessment on our operations in Malaysia and interviews with workers a couple of years back, we found out that even with our policy and process back then, we found out that our workers were still paying certain amounts of costs. Certain amount of costs were still being incurred by the workers who came to work with us. So a few things that we decided once we found out about that. So number one, we made a public commitment on committing to reimburse the recruitment costs which were incurred by our workers and former workers. And basically we then started to focus on at first reimbursement of recruitment fees and costs for our current workers. So what that entailed is essentially around the key question that we had to ask was, how much do we basically pay back the workers themselves? So what we did was, we worked with an external third party, Impact. So Rosie from the previous panel just now, her organization, we worked with them to essentially interview a significant amount of our workers to try and understand what are the costs which were incurred by them for each and every nationality. So what happened was we actually then landed on a number based on the interviews with workers of what is the costs incurred by nationality, and we applied several things which included interest, opportunity costs onto that number itself to then land with a final number. So once we had the number for each and every nationality, and the numbers range based on the country that they come from, we then undertook a large worker communication and engagement process to basically try and explain to the workers themselves, number one, what this payment is all about, and why they are getting this payment, and the amount that they'll be getting paid. So there's a large scale sort of communication process to try and explain to them the reasoning behind that. And then what we also did was we opened up our grievance mechanisms and grievance channels to them for them to then call up in the event that they have any questions. And once that particular process has been conducted, we then basically transferred the sum of money into their individual bank accounts as a lump sum. So some companies actually decide to pay it in stages, but we decided to make a lump sum payment one-off. And then we got a third party to then come in to validate that the payment has indeed been sort of banked into each and everyone's individual bank accounts. So that is essentially with regards to the current existing workers that we already had, and at this point in time, all of our existing workers have already been repaid already. So if you were to move on to former workers, so this is where it got a bit more challenging, because number one, they're no longer working with us, and they're all spread out across the various countries where they originate from. So the first thing that we did was basically we actually then set up a sinking fund, where the amount of money owed to our workers were then put into a sinking fund and set aside, and cannot be touched. And then we also set up a sinking fund governance committee, where the representatives of the sinking fund of this committee essentially is to oversee the process of reimbursement from that particular sinking fund, and the members of the committee revolved around a senior independent director, and an external legal counsel, and some of our senior management team as well. So they basically had oversight on this particular process of reimbursement. And the second thing that we did after that was we then hired legal counsel in each and every one of our source countries to basically be our representation there. And once that has been set up, we actually conducted another huge round of marketing, communication, and outreach program to try and reach as many of our former workers as possible. And the process is then, if they were a former Sime Darby plantation worker, they can then come to contact the local legal counsel, and there's an application process where they needed to provide documentation to basically confirm that they have previously worked with us, and we will then the legal counsel will then validate this on our records, and once it's been validated, the funds will be transferred into their bank accounts as well. So this is basically.
I forgot to give you the 1 minute warning. Sorry,
okay, sure. So I guess that the challenge with regards to that was essentially around trying to reach as many of our workers as possible, and also to validate that those people were indeed our workers. And the second challenge is basically to make sure that there was no representatives who are acting on behalf of workers as well. And the third one I wanted to quickly talk about was essentially around our ethical recruitment process, where previously we already had a previous version of our ethical recruitment process, and based on the experience that we've had, we actually looked at further enhancing it. We actually are working with Andy. I think he's in the hall now, to actually relook at how we can improve on our ethical recruitment process to minimize the risk of workers paying any fees or incurring any cost once they are selected to be hired by us. And this is basically I can go on and on about talking about this, but this is where a lot of work is currently being done on the ground to try and practically implement our zero recruitment policy. But I'll stop there for now, since Neha's given me the time warning.
Thank you. And I think we'll have that you left us with an important point, and so I think we'll be able to get into that in the Q&A. Next we have Aneska. Please go ahead. And Aneska, I know you can't see me, so I can't give you warnings, but I'll interrupt you. I'm sorry. But
thank you.
You'll have plenty of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Neha. Just interrupt me and I'll stop. So I prepared some notes yesterday for this conference, and then when the event started, I started to scratching all my notes and writing new ideas, because I just found out that what I was going to say was already said by other people. But then I thought, this is incredible, because this only shows that we all have a common vision of the change that needs to happen, and we all are looking for the best way of achieving that transformation and that change. And I hope to contribute to this conversation from a funders and philanthropy perspective, as we are not experts on repayment and remediation, but we do work with grantees, and I would like to share some of the experiences of some of our grantees on the ground, especially those working in Mexico. And I would like to take the opportunity also to send a message to other funders following this forum on the need to invest in labor rights, in the labor rights agenda, especially in the Global South and especially in Latin America. So Fundación Avina is a global organization rooted in the Global South that works through collaborative efforts to promote systemic change. We work as connectors, but also as investors by providing funding to diverse initiatives, mainly in Latin America. We currently are leading the Periplo project supported by the Walmart Foundation. of a group of civil society organizations working in Mexico that aims to contribute to the creation of a more equitable labor migration system in the agricultural supply chains. First thought I would like to share with you from our experience is that collaboration is hard. It's really hard, takes a lot of time and effort, but it's also necessary and it's urgent. And I would like to say this because I can see the potential in this room, and each time we shake hands, we know that we should collaborate more and be more proactive in the collaboration. So based on the information provided by Periplo partners, it's clear that the Mexican migrant workers face enormous obstacles in accessing repayment. And based on the information gathered from our partners on the ground, we haven't heard of a single case of repayment initiated proactively by an employer. And for a grievance to occur, the worker needs to go through a very complex process. The experience of our partners usually shows that the company will try to avoid the repayment, and the local context will make it harder for the worker to access the payment. A lot must happen before a worker receives his or her repayment. It is imperative to note that this doesn't happen, the repayment doesn't happen without the support and the commitment of civil society organizations, unions, or lawyers who support the workers and engage in a long and sometimes very expensive process. The Periplo project has brought together a diverse group of organizations that are sharing a common vision of the transformation that needs to happen. The Centro de los Derechos del Migrante and Tlachinolan, working in supporting workers in the community of origin, Cierto by promoting a responsible recruitment model in Mexico and the US, Stronger Together, and Verite, engaging in promoting best practices among growers, just to mention some of them. And through the work of these organizations, we know that there is an enormous power imbalance between Mexican agricultural workers and their employers and the intermediaries. There have been some improvements, but those have happened because of the pressure and efforts of workers and their organizations that are supporting them. Additionally, most CSOs do not have the capacity to deal with all the cases. Rachel and Joe already mentioned this morning the number of workers that increases every year. And in order for repayments to be sustainable, it is vital that employers, buyers, investors, governments, and regulators work together to ensure the adoption and implementation of responsible recruitment systems. We at Avina and at Periplo believe in the collective and individual power. We will support the efforts of civil society organizations accompanying migrant workers, and we see the need to keep investing in educating migrant workers, but also in educating and informing employers and promoting human rights due diligence perspective that includes the recruitment process and ensures accountability of agencies and companies. And also, there won't be a best practice approach without workers' participation. And second thought of this evening, ensuring workers' participation is very challenging, but is, again, needed and urgent. It was really exciting to see Maritza Perez Obando this morning and Gerardo Reyes participating in this event. And we need to keep supporting their participation and listen to their experiences. I counted yesterday at least 7 people that were working together in different countries, ensuring that Maritza could participate virtually today. So it takes a lot of effort. It can be done, and we need to keep doing it.
And let's get one more minute, please.
Thank you. Yeah. So Workers, rather than being passive recipients of payments, must be involved and included across all key stages of repayment process, including investigation, repayment calculation, verification, etc. They must be part of any solutions to any problem. Building community and building trust and power through information and effective participation is key. Lastly, and just to finish, through the Periplo project, we are promoting the adoption by companies of the human rights due diligence in line with the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. And just to share with you, we have started a community of practice on human rights due diligence in Mexico. They started to meet last year, and we hope to continue strengthening this ecosystem of diverse stakeholders in Mexico and keep promoting the collaboration among this group, collaboration with a purpose, and that is promoting an inclusive and effective dialogue, which we find key to achieve any success in the transformation that we are looking for. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. And so I have a number of follow-up questions, but in the interest of as much as we can do in this hybrid situation, having a dialogue, I'd like to just ask Bonnie in the room to maybe raise the first 3 questions from the audience, either virtual audience or the ones in the room that have come up. Bonnie, maybe we can take 3 questions at a time. I don't want to overwhelm, but I think more than one is probably a good idea.
Okay, so we have a lot of very good questions. I think since we have time, it might be easier 2 by 2. They're thematically related. The first question is, well, we have one participant who's asking, are there scenarios where the U.S. forced labor import ban is not conducive to remediation? You know, and if this is the case, are there lessons that could be drawn to go into the draft EU proposal for a similar forced labor import ban? So what could Europe do better? That's the question. And then I know the last speaker spoke about migrant workers should be involved in the process of the whole remediation. We have another participant asking, are there concrete examples where they're involved in all stages of the remediation process? The last 2 questions, I could raise it now, perhaps, or later? Okay, now. Is on the theme following up from the last session, which is about call sharing. So one question focused on, is it your impression that large-scale repayment is rare in the case of the withhold release orders? And if so, how do we push for repayment on a broader scale, as WROs will remain rare? And the second question, the second subpart, is call sharing again, following from our previous session on ethical recruitment. Do you think that buyers and brands should play their part in taking some of the burdens of remediation, rather than just leaving it to the suppliers? So, how would this look like? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's Bonnie. I was told your name was Bonnie, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Why don't we start with Anasuya, because there were a few questions there related to the U.S. Tariff Act and WROs. And I know, Anasuya, I can't see you, but I know that you also through the TAG, which we're members of, we've been also engaging on other due diligence models and other similar trade mechanisms like the Tariff Act outside of the United States. So those 2 questions that were sort of related to that. And then Agnieszka and Rashid, just to prepare you, Rashid, I think from your specific example, how you're dealing with some of the things that were raised in regarding workers specifically, and then the role of companies. And then Agnieszka, I think you heard the questions that were targeted towards you too. So why don't we go Anasuya, Agnieszka, and then Rashid. Go ahead.
Great. And I think I might start with the first question that you posed to me, Bonnie, around whether WROs can be fit for purpose when it comes to remediation in all cases. In the case of state-imposed forced labor, I mean, we draw the differentiation there. But at least for the purposes of our discussion today, I think in most facility-specific or fishing vessel-specific or farm-specific WROs, there is potential to engage in meaningful forced labor remediation, provided we have inputs from civil society. Workers on the ground are able to independently monitor and verify the situation and verify their situation, and they are part of the very design of the forced labor remediation process. Now, this is something I forgot to mention during my remarks. This entire process is not baked into the statute. It is not baked into the import ban laws in the United States. And I know that there's efforts by our partners in the EU to have a more remedy-focused instrument in the EU import ban or market placement mechanism, however you want to call it. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, that in the US Tariff Act, the section itself, there is nothing that prescribes how forced labor remediation should happen through this process. It has evolved over the last 4 or 5 years. We've actually seen good progress and understanding from Customs and Border Protection in how remediation might differ from region to region and product to product and sector to sector. And it's part of our continuing advocacy push to ensure that there isn't an over-reliance on just one mechanism as a silver bullet. There isn't an over-reliance on just social auditing. There isn't an over-reliance on these corrective action plans. There isn't an over-reliance on companies making promises and then being able. There isn't an over-reliance on companies just coming out with more codes of conduct and plans for future implementation. So through this process, CBP has, at least in the past 3-4 years, been more discerning about requiring proofs of payment around recruitment fees, proofs of payment around back wages. So I think that is definitely some progress. And I think there was another question on whether large-scale repayments are rare in the WRO and import ban context. I think the Malaysian example will show that it has been happening en masse, and more than, as I noted earlier, more than 50 million at least in recruitment fee payments and back wages have gone out to workers through the WRO process. So hopefully we can only scale up from there. And then I don't know if I missed a question. I was trying to write down everything, but maybe Neha, back to you if you want to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anvita. And I must say, and Ashish, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I don't know why it's echoing all of a sudden. Are you guys hearing that too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Meha. So I think.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I think I'll touch a bit about the question around the responsibilities of the actors across the supply chain, because that's one area where we actually are looking into as well. Because if you look at with regards to the implementation of the sort of interventions that we put in place, things like our ethical recruitment process and our remediation process, all of those sort of interventions were basically funded by us. But not all companies are able to sort of invest as much as ours. So essentially, I mean, the point I wanted to raise is that for us to basically have more holistic change for the industry itself, we need all supply chain actors to basically play a role, and there needs to be a shared responsibility between the upstream, downstream, and consumer goods products, and all the way up to the end consumer, on the expectation. Number one, the expectation of ethical recruitment of migrant workers, and also the remediation of any recruitment fees or recruitment costs. And an example that I can give is essentially, we are already partnering with one of our customers who is co-investing in implementation of grievance mechanisms in our own operations, because they also feel that because they are attached to our supply chain, they need to make sure and invest in making sure that their supply chain is also free of forced labor. So what would help the industry itself would be, more and more of these sort of collaborations across the entire value chain and co-investment as well, so that we can have a more holistic change and improvement of migrant worker rights. I think I'll stop there for now and hand it back over to you, Neha.
Rashid. And I was trying to say before there was an echo, one of the other things.
I think the echo is you now.
It is. Maybe if you Rashid, I think you yourself it might not. Thank you. Okay. So I was saying echoing. Well, just very quickly, maybe honestly, you talked about this a little bit. My voice is echoing. But one of the other things that we talked about in regards to the question is ensuring that there's some sort of worker emergency fund or worker remediation fund. That if employers are going to use recruitment agents, that they have to pay into a fund or there's a bond, so that workers aren't left high and dry if companies cannot pay the recruitment fees. So just one of the things to think about, and there's more details about it, maybe obviously you can talk about. But Nesta, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
Yeah.
Jump in just for a second. Neha was talking about how some of us in our coalitions have conceptualized in very early stages about a tariff act, a worker emergency fund, which is financed, well, we'd hope that it would be financed by penalties that the US government can impose on the US brands and buyers for importing products made using forced labor. In 2020, the US government issued its first ever forced labor penalty against Pure Circle, a stevia company, for importing stevia made using prison labor from China, which was not a big sum, a $575,000 penalty. We haven't seen a single forced labor penalty since. So when that came out, we were excited at that money goes to the Treasury, the US Treasury, by the way. So when that came out, we were excited by the prospect of having that getting channeled into a worker emergency fund to offset some of the challenges that can come immediately once a WRO is issued. So I think probably that's what Neha was talking about.
Yes, thank you, Anthea. And Nesta, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So about the question of concrete examples, I was cheating actually and asking Rachel if she could provide concrete examples of cases of workers participating in the whole process. And yes, I mean, we've seen workers receive reimbursement through collective organizing and approaching the employer. And Rachel was sharing this with me by WhatsApp that when they organize, approach the employer and demand repayment, that's when it works. And when they don't get the repayment, they reach out asking for help, and usually they reach out to the Centro de los Derechos del Migrante or their organization. I'm sure Cierto has had some cases. So I would ask Rachel if you could share a concrete example with the room. Maybe with the mic.
Hi, I'm sorry, just to interrupt. There's somebody who's close to wherever the Zoom is that's laughing and speaking, and so we can't, Rashid and I can't hear anything. So just to note that for anybody who happens to be near the laptop, we're only hearing you. So sorry. And if somebody in the room is speaking, if they can have a mic, it's hard to hear if they're not mic'd.
I'll turn it on, and maybe that'll help. Thank you. In terms of like the question, and honestly, it's sort of surprising for me because we have never seen employers voluntarily reimburse recruitment fees, like really at all. And we talk to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of workers every year, and it's always through worker organizing, through workers approaching their employers. And when that doesn't work, taking other action, like legal action, filing complaints, filing lawsuits is what, at the end of the day, workers are doing to ensure that they get reimbursed. And we have lots of examples of those, but essentially that's what we've seen. So I can tell you one is and I feel like this might be Jose de Lira, a member of our Migrant Defense Committee, was recruited to work in the United States. When he got to the U.S., his passport was confiscated. In Mexico, he had been charged a fee as well, and he knew things weren't right because he had been through training. So he organized with his colleagues. They approached the boss. They asked for, their passports back and their money. The boss refused. He called us, and then we called some local organizations who were able to go out and provide backup support in their engagements with the employer, and then got the Attorney General involved, and then there was a process through the New York Attorney General. So what I'm saying is like, employers typically don't turn over the recruitment fees voluntarily. It takes a lot of work on behalf of migrant workers to actually get the money that they're owed. And so I hope that was what you were looking for.
Thank you, Rachel. I just would like to end this panel with this image. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of people behind the workers to get repayment. So it's not, we often think about the worker and the employer and they talking, and somehow the worker gets the repayment, but there's a lot of effort behind each worker, and the work that the civil society organizations, union, lawyers are doing on the ground at the communities of origin and destination is key to succeed. So I thank you, Rachel. Yeah.
So again, I'm so sorry. There's somebody in the room that's having a conversation that just heard the words ITC. If you are talking about the ITC in the room, please leave the room because we can hear everything. And then unfortunately, Rashid and I can't hear it now. Okay, but I don't think we can change that. Anyway, and Bonnie, any more questions in the room? I apologize to people. I can't hear. So any other questions in the room, Bonnie?
Yes, we have more questions. We have one here asking simply, how many times should a company repay before the message is reached home? Meaning that they should not be charging workers recruitment fees and related costs.
Yeah. And Bonnie, are there other questions you want to just go through them all since we only have 3 minutes left?
I could. I'm a bit worried about sliding over the time
maybe just
because we need to
ask-
have a hard stop. Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead. 2 more questions.
No.
Sure. I mean, well, there's another question about repayment of fees. Should that be the only sanction? How should it be combined with the prosecution?
So, Anastasiya, do you want to talk about that? Because in the recommendations that you discussed in your opening, there were recommendations beyond just the actual fees that workers pay. Or do you want to talk about that?
Sure, and I think maybe the first question to Rashid, probably, sorry to put you on the spot. So on prosecutions, I think one of the reasons why we have focused so much on the Tariff Act is because of how quickly it can affect the corporate bottom line and expedite some of these processes in countries like Malaysia. And then there was a petition that we worked on with members of the seafood working group to exclude fishing nets from Thailand that were made using prison labor. And just weeks after that went in and news of it sort of came out, the Thai government announced all of these policy changes to the prison labor system. Still requires a lot of work, and this was very specific to the production of fishing nets. But just to kind of highlight the importance of import bans as a mechanism that can be leveraged to expedite some of these changes on the ground, some things that we've been working on for years in many of these countries. Now I think the threat, even the potential threat of an import ban is prompting changes, and now companies are being more proactive. A prosecution, and I think this is something our organization, we also work on litigation, and but prosecution has been slow, and every year the Trafficking in Persons report will tell you how many prosecutions there have been in the whole world for forced labor, and you'll notice that it's a really, really small small number when compared to the number of people that the ILO estimates are held in forced labor around the world. But that said, we don't want to see the import ban mechanism in isolation. It is complementary to a lot of other mechanisms. For example, when there was a vessel that was sanctioned by a WRO, and then soon thereafter there were also global Magnitsky sanctions imposed on the owners of the vessel. So the two mechanisms kind of like had the two mechanisms worked together, and there was some exchange of information between US Customs and Border Protection and the agency and Treasury around this. We've also seen this happen in the context of Department of Commerce in the United States. They can impose, they can have a list of entities where US companies and persons are prevented from exporting technology or expertise to those entities abroad, which is something what we call an export ban as opposed to an import ban. So there's a whole range of tools, and we've always encouraged a whole of government approach to addressing forced labor in US supply chains. That includes, of course, prosecution, and we hope to see more prosecutions on the back of Tariff Act enforcement, because I think the evidence base for all of this starts at the same place, and then you can sort of develop on that and get more information.
Thank you, Olivia. Since you want the last word, I know we're out of time, so I'm just going to let you have the last word.
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to answer the question about how many times does a company need to do reimbursement. I think that was the question. I think from our point of view, if a worker has incurred any cost to actually get the job, they need to be reimbursed. So the focus on our side is to make sure, and a lot of effort that's been put in place now is to make sure that these kind of things don't happen in the first place. So that's why we're spending a lot of time and resources in trying to practically implement on the ground, what does a zero recruitment cost sort of recruitment actually work, and putting in various sort of controls in place, working with agents and doing capacity building, doing a lot of awareness raising for potential workers. So to try and see how we can further improve our ethical recruitment process. And it's not easy, it's challenging, and although we also have a control only over a limited sort of scope, which is basically our the process of our own recruitment, but there are still other actors, and other stakeholders who also need to be involved in it. So a holistic approach to ethical recruitment with all actors in the sort of recruitment process should also be required as well.
Thank you all so much. A big thank you to Anasuya, to Rashid very early in the morning, to Jessica for traveling all the way to New York. Thank you to IHRB for inviting me. And again, I hope, as I said at the beginning, that the big takeaway that we take from this is the importance of workers and workers themselves being able to exercise their agency front and center on the issue of remedy and remediation, and not be seen as an afterthought or as beneficiaries, but instead the main stakeholders for all this. Thank you all so much, and good luck with the rest of the forum.
Thank you, Neha.
Moving swiftly on, we don't spoil you with too many tea breaks, do we? All those lovely cakes and goodies out there. But those of you still watching online, I'm sorry about the absence of refreshments, but for those of us in New York, in half an hour we have a little reception that will start, so please stay for that. And we have a guest as well during that, but there'll be plenty of time for socializing and networking. Listen, I introduced myself earlier. I'm John Morrison. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Human Rights in Business, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. It's been an amazing day. I think the Global Forum's come a long way. The caliber of the conversations, the integrity through which each person comes forward, and I think we really get to the complexity. I don't think anybody feels that we've made as much progress as we hoped to over the past 6 years, but I think we know what the issues are now, and small amounts of progress. And it's with that that I am very happy to be with Mahmoud Kutub, who is the Executive Director for Worker Welfare and Labour Rights for the Supreme Committee for the Delivery and Legacy of the Qatar 2022 World Cup. Now that's soccer for any Americans in the room. You're not allowed to pick the ball up, you kick it. And actually it's pretty popular in most parts of the world. And actually the American teams, your women's team's very good, by the way. I'm very pleased that the former goalkeeper of your team is now our Executive Director of our Centre for Sport and Human Rights, Mary Harvey, and a nod to her and all her colleagues. Now, for us at IHRB, we started working on this issue around the time of the London Olympics. My colleague Neil, who you know, led a campaign called the Staff Wanted campaign, focused on the 5,000 hotels in London. And we worked with Anti-Slavery International and the Metropolitan Police to really highlight the issue of worker exploitation in the hotel industry in London. And that was the beginnings of a journey for us. Back then, human rights wasn't in the bidding criteria for mega sporting events. And you were awarded the Qatar Cup really early. It was 2010, is that right?
That's right.
And I mean, let's be honest, worker welfare wasn't part of the bid, right? And we'll come on to that. Mahmoud, you were part of the bid committee in 2009. That's right. And then the Supreme Committee itself was founded in 2011 after it was awarded. Just say a little bit about that transition between the bid committee and then the Supreme Committee for Delivery. Were they the same people? Or?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I was part of the original bid team, joined in July 2009. And yes, we had a couple of options, really. We could either fold and then come back 3-4 years before the tournament, which is very customary. Or we can use that opportunity to really build the state and the infrastructure required and making sure that there is a system around legacy that will have lasting effect for Qatar and the region. So I think we took a decision to say, look, we have an opportunity with the number of years, over a decade effectively, I think it was, to be able to actually work together as a unit, expand, build, and then focus a lot on legacy. That was really a key pivotal point in our decision.
So if we go back in time, if it wasn't part of your bid to host the World Cup, worker welfare and responsible recruitment, when did it come into focus for you? Can you remember the day or the week? Or
so again, I think under the auspices of social human development, there is a chapter in the bid book. I co-authored that with a colleague of mine, and a lot of it was focused on underprivileged communities throughout, not just in Qatar, but also throughout the region. And we developed various programs. One of the programs that I designed was Generation Amazing, which was using football as a social development tool to help underprivileged youth throughout the region. We went to Syria, we went to Lebanon, refugee camps, went to Nepal. I personally went to Nepal, Pakistan as well. So that was really a taste for FIFA that there is hope from this World Cup around legacy from a social standpoint. That was really pivotal. That was really the reason I stuck around, frankly speaking.
Which year is this? So
this was 2009, 2009-10, as we were preparing the actual bid book. Right. That was the fundamental reason why I joined, and that was the reason why I stayed. It was really the legacy from this World Cup. It wasn't really about the 30 days of football, for me personally at least. And Hassan, our Secretary General, really sold me on that. And he was genuine. He believed in it. He was committed to it. And I wanted to be part of it. It was quite historic. Workers' welfare came, or discussion around the challenge of workers' welfare, came when we were developing our first 3-year strategy, which I led that effort. This was our 3-year strategic plan. And coupled with that was a legacy framework, a very comprehensive document that really explored how we can leverage on the World Cup to really expand on the QNV 2030. That's the Qatar National Vision 2030, which is built off of 4 pillars: economic development, social and human development, economic diversification, and environmental sustainability. And so we really built it on that, on the premise that we can be used as an accelerator of the QNV 2030 vision and the National Development Strategy goals. So you'll find it in our strategic plan, as well as our legacy framework around 2011, 2012.
Now, I'm right in thinking that worker fees are illegal under Qatari law.
Correct.
But I mean, a lot of attention was turned to the kafala system that was, and to some extent still is, prevalent in Gulf countries, where the state essentially privatizes the recruitment system, and families have quotas, etc. When did you really come to a realization that this was going to be a big risk, a big problem for you to manage?
It was shortly after we won the bid. Well, I mean, one of the probably the most key major steps we took after winning was what we call the exploratory phase, which was really a brainstorming, I'd say over probably a good year to 2 years, where we engaged with civil society, non-governmental organizations, public, private sector, companies, the government, to try to understand what is working and what is not working. I mean, I think we recognize that we're building stadiums. So we needed to have systems in place. Now the question for us was, do we adopt the Qatar labor law, which existed? It was sound at the time, there's no doubt about that. Implementation or enforcement is obviously another issue, but as a law, it was solid, but there were gaps. And I think fundamentally for us, as we were engaged with civil society and all of them, and you named them, that were involved in this process, we found an opportunity to really create a robust monitoring and enforcement system. And that's where I think our system is quite unique. So I think fundamentally the standards that we rolled out in 2014, this was a key turning point in the labor rights landscape of Qatar for us as an organization to have these standards. And the standards were governed, and the operational element is through the 4-tier auditing system that really has become effectively the backbone of our standards and our system over the years, really.
Now, I think the first time we first met, I can't remember when it was exactly, but it's probably about 6, 7, 8
years. It was
a while ago. And I guess there was, we were like cats, you know, sort of, going around the room like this, circling. And it was the time that Sharon Barrow was General Secretary of the ITUC. Right. She called Qatar a slave state, I believe. That I remember her saying that. And there really was a lot of distrust, I would say. How well received, I mean, trade unions are not allowed to organize in Qatar, but you did it, you made it possible for BWI to do inspections. Yeah. How did you create space for civil society and trade unions within Qatar, where then that's not traditionally part of the way things are done there?
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Why is it important? Why did you think it was important?
It's essential. I mean, I say this to others that you know, ask us for advice now when you look at the region and the global landscape. You know, what did you do right, what did you not do right, and so on. But I think collaboration from the beginning, I think it was really the essence of our program. Transparency through our public reporting, but collaboration with key stakeholders, partners, has been absolutely essential. I think we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that the success we've achieved, despite the challenges that existed, I think is really, collaboration is at the heart. You know, BWI, as you mentioned, John, they played a key role. Can you imagine for a minute at that time, having again, it's Qatar, trade unions, as you mentioned, they can't operate. And for us to actually engage in a collaboration and sign an MOU with the biggest construction trade union in the world, to give them access effectively, right? I mean, they had open access to all of our stadiums. They could meet with the workers, they can find out what's good, what's not, what's working, what's not, and so on, and help us effectively improve on those conditions. I mean, it's really quite historic, I think, at the time, and this was in 2016 that we signed the collaboration. Me and the late Jin Suk Lee were co-chair. She was my co-chair in this particular group, and it was a joint working group made up of both SC members of the SC the organization, as well as trade unions from BWI's affiliates all over the world. And we've published annual reports since, really sort of sharing what has worked, what hasn't worked, and all those challenges. I think that element of transparency, the openness to criticism, which has been really a key cornerstone of our program, I think this is something we've been true to it. We believe in it wholeheartedly. I think it's absolutely valuable for a lot of organizations, regardless whether it's governments that are building infrastructure projects, mega infrastructure projects, or multinationals. I think you need to be able to operate outside of your comfort zone. Get those in to give you an independent review of what's really working, what's not working.
I mean, you mentioned Jin Suk, who I think many of us miss, and it's
yes,
quite sad to look back. And also Professor John Ruggie, who authored the UN Guiding Principles, who did that report for FIFA back in 2015, 2016, that maybe didn't set the roadmap for you, but has certainly set the roadmap for FIFA events subsequent. Tell me a bit about how, once you'd identified responsible recruitment as a salient issue for you, how, and I believe there were about 30,000 construction workers
at peak.
At peak.
That's right.
What were the key issues that you identified, and how did you prioritize which ones to address?
Right. So I think first and foremost, John, knowledge is important. I think one has to really understand the crux of the issue fundamentally, right? We talk about it, but how much of it do we really know? Have we spoken, have we engaged with workers to understand exactly what they've went through to get a better life for themselves and their families overseas? And I think part of because of our system and our auditing system, which as I mentioned, it's 4-tiered. One is the contractors are obligated to audit themselves and their supply chain. This is mandatory per our compliance, per our workers' welfare standards. And they're held liable if they do not, by the way. There's penalties associated with that. Then we would go in as the Supreme Committee and we carry out 100% audit of the supply chain. On a quarterly basis, just to give you some context, we've put in about 150,000 hours of audits and inspections since 2016. Quite extensive. We have legs on the ground day in, day out. And then you have Impact, our external monitor. We've had a lovely relationship with Rosie. She's been tremendous, her and her team, healthy tension. And again, in her, it is a healthy tension, no doubt. I mean, I love Rosie to death. And really, and it's been a tremendous collaboration. That's another element of a collaboration, as I believe is pivotal, is having that external monitor with you as part of your due diligence program. So they would come in, of course, and they would do ad hoc randomized audits. They can't really do as much as we do, but they go in, there's a deep dive that they were able to do. Throughout that process, John, we're able to really discover the issues of recruitment fees. It doesn't really take much to realize through the audit, but more importantly, through the workers' experience and the engagement that we have with workers through the interview process. We spend a lot of time speaking to workers, eating with them, spending time trying to understand the challenges, what they face. Then that issue really comes to the surface and you realize how significant it is.
Is it the most important issue?
It's one of the most important issues. Because
what are the others?
Look, living conditions were obviously very important. When we set out on this journey in I would say probably 2014, before we started construction, accommodations in Qatar needed some improvement. And our standards has a huge emphasis on decent living conditions. They're very specific, what we're expecting from companies. And it includes much more than just room and board. We're talking about access to a gym, access to Wi-Fi, green space, recreational space. It's very, very stringent. And we audit and inspect, and companies are held liable for that. That was really a major challenge in the early days. And you can imagine, a worker goes out every day, is tired, wants to come back home, speak to their families overseas. They want Wi-Fi access to be able to communicate. So we wanted to do that, give them a home away from home. The issue of pay will always be fundamental. Wage theft exists. It exists in every country around the world. Our systems are there, and of course, during the time that we were running our program, the WPS was instituted in Qatar, the Wage Protection System. Yeah. It still required some work and some auditing and inspections and improvement. I know the ILO was very much focused on that with the government, and it's come a long way. But certainly recruitment fees and the payment of recruitment fees, the fact that they've been in debt bondage, and I heard this morning, in the case of Bangladesh, they were spent over 3 years just to repay that. This is real. Yeah. I mean, when you speak to the workers, you realize how significant it is.
So of your 30,000 workers at peak, how many of them had pay fees? What percentage?
The majority. Let's be honest, the majority. I mean, I think what we have found, though, for example, in some of the African states, is that the workers would have paid certain costs. Right. What is recruitment fees? It's much. It's a lot. There's several figures that go into that, really, right? And I think what we've seen in some of the
sending countries or receiving in Qatar or before
they even set foot, before they step on a plane, they would be in that bondage. We've seen in some of the African states where they would have paid for health examination before deploying. That's again, it's illegal, and so we rectify that. We step in. But by and large, it's a significant problem. It does affect most of the workers out of Nepal, Bangladesh.
And can you give a sense of the range, like the small, the smallest to the largest per migration corridor? Did you get a?
We've seen Bangladesh to be the highest paid.
And how much?
Anywhere between. I mean, you have experts here. I know Andy's in the room, and he probably knows this better than I do. But I think it's quite significant, Bangladesh. I mean, I think we've seen cases upwards of $3,500 in some cases. And we've looked at averages, and I think what we did is really look at the ILO benchmark in terms of what is the full cost of recruitment. We also retained the services, commissioned is a better word, for an expert, a very renowned expert at Hamad bin Khalifa University, to do both a remittance study for us as well as a recruitment fee study. Right. And both of those, I think, helped us fully understand the challenge. And only then were we able to actually start thinking about taking meaningful steps, despite the fact that we were told this is too complex. Don't get involved, leave it to governments.
So I think what's kind of famous about your approach is you put the onus of proof on the employer and not on the worker, right?
Correct.
So you assumed the workers had paid the fees unless the employer could prove otherwise.
Correct.
Which is quite radical, right? I mean, I don't think many businesses in this room take that approach to the way they deal with this issue. When did you decide that you would take that approach?
I think once we realize there is a significant problem, and again, money back in the pockets of workers means something. Prevention is always better than, obviously, remediation is important, but you really want to work towards prevention, and there's no doubt this is something that all of us believe in that. I think in early 2017, John, one of the things, there were twofold, actually, two steps that were taken. One was managing the supply chain. That was key. Understanding exactly who's on your site, not just main contractors, I mean the tier 2s and the tier 3s at the time, which we had. We actually worked through that supply chain management strategy to eliminate even the tier 3s, right, over the years, which was significant, by the way.
You mandated that? You
Yes.
said no tier 3?
Well, no, we didn't mandate. By having access to those firms meant that we can actually institute certain systems or requirements on the main contractors to audit and inspect, otherwise they will be penalized.
Right.
From their perspective, they want the easy way out. So it was easy to say, get rid of the tier 3s, let's minimize the effort that we have to do. It was really, we went from a model of about 55% main contractors, the rest on tier 2s, so then the main contractor,
Right.
the sort of pendulum shifted. So 2017, supply chain management, we had access to every subcontractor before they deploy, so we could vet them, basically. We had to give the green light for the subcontractors to be deployed. That was a major step in us as workers' welfare, that is, managing the supply chain. And the second step, as you mentioned, John, was really putting the onus or the burden of proof on the employer, not the employee. We stopped asking the employees, frankly speaking. I mean, it was really bound to the employer.
You didn't try and evidence what the employees were saying. You just took it as...
You're effectively guilty until you
Right.
prove to me you're innocent.
Right.
Right, and you have to disclose.
Yeah.
And this is how the process, or at least the negotiation began in early 2017. And of course, the process took months of negotiation, of conversation with them, to try to educate them, to raise their awareness. There is an element, often, we seem to think that businesses are just corrupt and they're just basically out to make a buck at the expense of the workers. But there is ignorance, right, in the supply chain. This is quite evident, by the way. And what you find, particularly in my role, when I'm sitting with MDs, managing directors, or C-level, they really have no idea. They genuinely don't have any idea of what it takes to actually hire and the process of hiring and the recruitment. So for us, we took it as an opportunity to educate, raise awareness, and then break the news to them that you're going to have to cough up.
And how did they react? They were delighted when you told them that.
They were, there was a lot of jaws dropped in the room. I mean, there was a shock. I have to admit, there was a shock. From
Did any try legal action or breach of contract?
They did not.
Did you have a contractual basis to do this?
We had a contractual basis not to deploy them on the site, yes. We could have prevented them from deploying.
On what grounds?
On the grounds that they're in violation of the standards. And the standards it was very clear in the standards. And the law is very clear that you cannot charge workers any recruitment fees.
And how did the Qatari government react to you enforcing the law?
I mean, Qatari government was very supportive. I mean, I think they've fully understood what we've done and the process that we've undertaken. The companies, more importantly, John, I think this was a collaborative notion. I mean, there's a notion that perhaps we actually imposed this strategy on them. It wasn't the truth at all. They actually signed up for this. They understood the value of doing this. They wanted to right the wrong, and they committed to doing it. And I think we didn't want to put them out of business. So, and often you'd hear in the construction sector, we're basically, our margins are very thin. We're losing money, which I never really understood, and I still don't understand it. Why are you in this business if you're losing money? But anyway,
they always say that.
The construction sector is a rough sector. I think many of you must have heard about this. But I think we've tried to alleviate that risk by effectively putting them on a payment plan, right?
All right.
2 years, 3 years to repay that loan to the workers.
So it was material to them, these amounts of money?
Yeah.
And did any of them have evidence that the workers hadn't paid? Were any of them able to meet your challenge and say, here we are, we've documented? There wasn't a single one that said, here we go.
No.
No. So everyone had to pay, in effect.
They may have had an element of what it costs, whether it's a health examination or whether government fees, but as a full cost of recruitment, no, they were not unable to do so. In fact, some of them thought that by hiring a recruitment agency, which costs roughly $200, by the way, that they did their job. No, we actually did ethical. We committed to an ethical recruitment process. We have an agent. Okay, was the agent licensed? That's another trait. And in many cases, there were unlicensed agents that we had to
And it was the contractors you were charging, not the second tier,
correct.
The employers, not the recruiters. How many of them were able to get the money back off second tier or
Well,
recruiters?
to be fair, just to clarify the point, if there is within the contracts between the employers and the brokers or the recruitment agents clauses regarding ethical recruitment, then they can get them on breach of contract, and this has happened by the way.
That has happened. Okay. Well, the World Cup's over. England didn't win.
My apologies.
Unfortunately.
What can I say?
Yeah.
The US didn't win.
There's always next time, but you're still in a job, right? So that's great. You're delivering a World Cup and it's finished. So I want that kind of job. So this is the legacy part of your mandate. So what does that mean in essence? Why are you still being paid to do? What do you do?
This is a question from my boss, who's not here. Hassan. Well, I mean, again, 13 years. You can imagine you can't just simply pack up in a month or two. It takes time. Look, I think we're very focused on the next phase. And the next phase for us is really a lot of the work of transitioning. One of the, again, an important point to mention is we moved from the construction sector audits and inspections, John, to the hospitality sector.
Yeah.
This was the first time in a global context where the hospitality sector audited and inspected. And if you recall, in Paris in 2018, we met with the ILO and the Ministry of Labor and FIFA and discussed this opportunity and the challenge before us. And we, as a team at the Supreme Committee, really stepped up to the challenge. I mean, we did a pilot with 5 hotels, and then we went on to audit about 150 plus hotels that were hosting fans and the football teams. And that's a major legacy. I think we're very proud of that effort only because of the commitment that the hotels have made, the seriousness of which they've improved their operations. What we've done since we won the World Cup is we didn't want to just fold and disappear. So we went back to those hotels, and we've done about 100 or so hotels since the World Cup to see how genuine was this effort. Was it just for the World Cup? Were they committed to it? And we were pleasantly surprised. Most of the hotels maintained the average improvement of a compliance score, and it's roughly about 15%.
The standards are not dropping now that the World Cup's over and everyone's looking somewhere
Certainly
else.
not in the hospitality sector.
Okay.
So far it's been very, very positive. I'm very
Okay.
optimistic about that.
Now, the GCC is alive with projects now, massive mega projects, sports, infrastructure in the deserts. To what extent are you able to get others to replicate what you've done?
We started having informal discussions with the neighbors to try to really promote our model. Our model is unique in the sense that it can be applied to both governments, mega projects, the private sector, and we've had conversations with multinationals about our model. And there have been multinationals that have adopted our model in some of their factories, by the way, when it comes to recruitment fees, that is. So our standards are very relevant to many organizations. Our transparency, our cooperation with civil society has been also of interest to many operators, as you can imagine.
They think you were crazy, did they?
Yeah, they think they thought we're crazy. They no longer think that. I think they've seen that there is a way to work with civil society in a meaningful way for the benefit of workers, fundamentally. And I think, and they are exploring that. And so they've come to us asking us about our advice and guidance. Look, we're very interested, there's no doubt. I mean, exporting this is what, from the beginning, I think, talking about the legacy, we've never really shied away from being honest about this is not just for Qatar, but also the wider region. You would have heard me say it. Certainly, Hassan Al-Thawadi has said it repeatedly, and we were genuine about this. And so anything that we can do to promote to work with Saudi, having a mega infrastructure boom that is happening currently, you can imagine the challenges before them, UAE, but also other markets, right? I mean, Malaysia, we were discussing Malaysia earlier, and other markets. I think there is definitely value, and not the least of which, of course, is the US with 2026 hosting the World Cup. There's a lot of lessons learned from our experience, and we've had those conversations, John, and I'm very, very optimistic that those can actually move forward.
We were talking a bit earlier today about impact, and I often get asked, which business and human rights initiatives around the world have actually made a tangible difference in the lives of people? And the Immokalee workers example was given here in the US. I would say the Accord in Bangladesh, this is 10 years since the Rana Plaza factory collapse, and that clearly has made things better. But would you say that your work, I mean, I would say, from what we know, at least for the 30,000 workers on the site, things weren't fantastic, right? There were still fatalities, etc. But in terms of everyone's expectation years before, but a considerable amount of leverage, right? There was the blockade on Qatar, there was a well-resourced government, there was COVID, international attention around it that you were able to leverage to some extent. Is that not just a bit of perfect storm of factors? How do you build similar leverage around other events so that you can do what is very difficult, I think, applying international standards in that context?
It is, I guess you could say it's a perfect storm. It's either an opportunity or perhaps even challenging in many ways. But I think ultimately, look, companies, organizations want to be associated with the brand. This is fundamental. And I think the World Cup is a big brand. Big mega events have that opportunity. And I think using that, and multinationals, I mean, we've had conversation with multinationals about using their brand to put leverage on companies to do the right thing to improve the working conditions. But it has to be used, right? I mean, ultimately, you can't shy away from it. We certainly didn't. I think we've recognized when we were told that the recruitment fees is a challenge you don't want to take on. We didn't just stand still, right? And this is just one of many. I mean, to think of $22.5 million being put back in the pockets of workers, John, this is not insignificant. I mean, Apple, as far as I'm aware, is the only other company in the world over probably a 15-year period, much longer than us, reimbursed $37 million plus dollars. So, and if you talk to Rosie and Impact, who've actually been helpful in validating the work that we've done, because we needed it. We wanted to make sure that our work not only received the credibility it deserved, but we wanted others to learn from it. Not just simply Qatar as a whole, but also multinationals around the world.
But do you, I mean, we're just about at time now, but the issue of repayment, is it the solution? Is it the fundamental solution to what's going wrong here? Or are you just feeding the beast, accepting the...
Money back in the pockets of workers means something.
Right.
Means something for them and their families, and you can't shy away from it. I think prevention is definitely absolutely the sort of, the ideal situation is to prevent this outright from the beginning before happening. And I'll tell you something, John, we have some success stories, and it's often we talk about the dire stories and the sad stories, but there's been some positive stories that are worth highlighting, because also positive breeds more positive. I mean, I think this is the key here. I mean, you can criticize till you go blue in the face, but sometimes it's really good to reflect and acknowledge when good work is being done. It only feeds better work, and it creates a level of competition. We're seeing it now in the region, by the way, and I think this is an important point. But I think you look at, for example, I'll give you an example, and there's quite a few. The hotel industry in of itself is an example of how they've improved their recruitment, by the way, process by eliminating the middleman and going directly hiring. But we've seen it also in major transportation. Muwasalat, for instance, which is a transportation company in Qatar. They had to ramp up to about 4,000 plus workers. They came to us, asked for our advice on how to do it right from the beginning. We advised them, we gave them the standards, we gave them the tools. We even embedded people that were trained per our standards within the Muwasalat sort of infrastructure. And they had drives in the sending countries, eliminating the middleman to hire directly. So we can avoid this outright, this issue of dealing with unlicensed brokers, exorbitant fees being paid. And this is just one of several stories. So I think, definitely, again, prevention is key, but remediation is an obligation on all of us if we can step in and try to right the wrong.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you so much for joining us today. A round of applause, please.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sean.
Difficult work in a difficult context, and thank you for being open with us today. It's for those of us here in the room, we have a reception, which is immediately outside. Do circulate, have a drink, but do stick around, because in half an hour we have a guest speaker who will be speaking to us briefly. And tomorrow, 9 o'clock start, allow time to get through security, and we start with an exciting focus on shipping and logistics. But thanks again for a brilliant day, everybody. And thanks to Neil and all my colleagues for a job well done. Thank you.